Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world where darkness was not an inconvenience to be banished with the flick of a switch, but a living presence that settled over cities like heavy velvet, transforming familiar streets into landscapes of shadow and fog. This was Victorian England, an empire at the height of its power, yet utterly intimate with mysteries that modern minds cannot fathom. In the decades between 1830 and 1900, as steam engines roared and telegraph wires stretched across continents, the people of Britain lived with one foot in the future and the other planted firmly in realms we would call supernatural, superstitious, or simply strange. They understood something we have lost in our floodlit nights and screen-bright bedrooms, that darkness is not empty, that sleep is not simple unconsciousness, and that the boundary between the living and the dead is far thinner than we pretend. Before we journey deeper into these gaslit shadows together, let me invite you to join our community at Boring Bedtime Stories, where we explore the fascinating darkness of history every week. If you find comfort in these strange tales from the past, if you appreciate falling asleep to mysteries that make the modern world seem less lonely, then subscribe now so you never miss a journey into the forgotten corners of human experience. We are building something special here, a place where curiosity meets rest, where learning and dreaming intertwine like the fog that once wrapped around Victorian London's bridges and alleyways. And speaking of building community, I am genuinely curious about you, the person listening to these words as you drift towards sleep. Before we continue into the depths of Victorian strangeness, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world right now. Are you in a modern apartment in Tokyo, a farmhouse in Argentina, a suburban bedroom in Ohio? There is something beautifully strange about how we can share these dark Victorian secrets across time and space, how your present moment connects to their vanished world through nothing more than curiosity and the sound of my voice. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is in your corner of the world. I read every comment, and I love knowing that these stories travel so far. Now, let us step through that velvet curtain together and enter a world that smelled of coal smoke and lilies, where gaslights hissed on street corners and cast shadows that seemed to move with intention. The Victorians lived in an age of profound contradiction. They were building the modern world, yes, laying railway tracks across continents, photographing the invisible, communicating instantly across oceans through copper wires that hummed with electric possibility. Yet simultaneously, they were more intimate with death than any generation before or since. Infant mortality was so common that families learned not to name their children until they survived their first year. Tuberculosis, that wasting disease they called consumption, turned the living into transparent ghosts long before death finally claimed them. Cholera swept through cities in waves, killing thousands in weeks, its cause mysterious, its arrival as sudden as summer storms. In such a world, death was not an aberration, but a constant companion, a familiar presence at every table, in every bedroom, waiting patiently in the corners where gaslight could not quite reach. This intimacy with mortality shaped everything about Victorian life, including and especially how they approached the simple act of sleep. For them, the boundary between sleeping and dying was gossamer thin, a connection reinforced by language itself. They spoke of sleep as death's younger sibling, referred to beds as furniture that served equally for rest and for final repose. When someone died peacefully, they said that person had simply fallen into eternal sleep, as if death were nothing more than closing your eyes and forgetting to wake. This was not morbid in their view, but rather realistic, an acknowledgement of truth that modern culture works desperately to deny. We hide our dying in hospitals, our dead in funeral homes, sanitizing mortality until it seems unreal. The Victorians lived with death in their homes, laid out their deceased in parlors, held wakes where family and friends kept vigil beside the body for days. They understood something we have forgotten, that accepting death's reality makes life more precious, not less. The objects surrounding Victorian sleep tell stories of this intimate relationship with darkness and mortality. Beds were massive pieces of furniture, often the most expensive items in a household, surrounded by heavy curtains that could be drawn completely closed, transforming the sleeping space into a fabric tomb. These bed curtains served practical purposes, certainly trapping warmth in houses where winter could kill and where coal fires offered the only heat. But they also created a psychological space, a private darkness within the larger darkness of night, a womb-like enclosure where the sleeper could retreat from the world entirely. To climb into a properly curtained Victorian bed was to perform a nightly rehearsal of death, to wrap yourself in darkness and stillness, to practice the art of letting go. The Victorians slept differently than we do, following rhythms that seem almost alien to our modern, consolidated 8-hour unconsciousness. Historical research has revealed that until the late 19th century, most people experienced what scholars call segmented sleep or biphasic sleep, dividing their night into two distinct periods. They would retire to bed shortly after sunset, around 8 or 9 in the evening, and sleep for approximately 4 hours. Then they would wake naturally, not to alarm clocks or artificial schedules, but because their bodies had completed the first cycle of rest. This period of wakefulness in the dead of night, lasting 1 to 2 hours, was not considered insomnia or disorder, but rather normal, expected, even valuable. During these midnight hours, people would pray, contemplate the day's events, read by candlelight, make love quietly beside sleeping children, visit neighbors who were also awake. There was a special quality to this time, a stillness and privacy impossible to find during the day, when responsibilities and other people's needs constantly intruded. Then, as naturally as they had woken, they would feel sleep returning and climb back under their heavy blankets for the second sleep, which would last until dawn. This pattern persisted for centuries, woven into the fabric of human biology, until gaslight and then electric light made night into artificial day. The Industrial Revolution demanded workers who could labor in shifts around the clock, who could ignore their body's natural rhythms in favor of factory schedules and production quotas. Gradually, consolidated sleep became the norm, a single unbroken block of unconsciousness more convenient for capitalism, but potentially less natural for human biology. Some modern sleep researchers argue that many cases of insomnia might actually be remnants of this older pattern, trying to assert itself, the body waking after 4 hours and expecting that period of quiet wakefulness before the second sleep. The Victorians lived through this transition, the last generation to remember when night had its own rhythms, when darkness meant something more than an absence of light. As we explore the strange customs and dark curiosities of this vanished era over the coming chapters, remember that the Victorians were not simply eccentric ancestors whose odd habits we can dismiss with comfortable superiority. They were people navigating tremendous change, standing at the threshold between the ancient world and modernity, trying to make sense of existence in an age when old certainties were crumbling, but new ones had not yet solidified. Their relationship with death, their sleeping rituals, their elaborate mourning customs, their fascination with spiritualism and the supernatural, all of these arose from genuine attempts to find meaning and comfort in a world that was transforming faster than human psychology could adapt. In their strangeness, we may find mirrors for our own era's anxieties, different forms, but similar depths. We too live in an age of accelerating change, when technology outpaces wisdom, when old certainties dissolve and new ones prove elusive. Perhaps the Victorians, from their gaslit distance, have wisdom to offer about how to remain human when the world insists we become something else. Close your eyes now, and let us walk together through their shadowed halls, where every corner holds a story, and every story holds a truth we might need to remember. Picture yourself in a Victorian bedroom as winter darkness falls early, around 5 in the evening, and will not lift again for 14 hours. You have finished your dinner, perhaps some mutton and potatoes, bread and butter, tea sweetened with precious sugar. The servants have cleared the table, banked the fires for the night, and drawn the heavy curtains against the cold that seeps through single-paned windows like invisible water. Your family gathers briefly in the parlor, But there is little to do once the sun has set. Candles are expensive, gas lighting is available only to the wealthy, and the alternative is sitting in darkness, burning costly fuel to illuminate hours that could be better spent in sleep. So around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, you climb the stairs to your bedroom, change into your night clothes, and slip between sheets that are always slightly damp from the pervasive moisture of English winters. You are not tired, not in the bone-deep way that comes from true exhaustion, but you go to bed anyway because night has arrived and there is nothing else to do. This is how first sleep begins. The concept of segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep as modern researchers call it, sounds strange to contemporary ears, accustomed to thinking of sleep as a single unbroken block of 8 hours. Yet for the Victorians, and for centuries of their ancestors, stretching back into medieval times and beyond, sleeping in 2 distinct periods was as natural as breathing, as normal as eating 3 meals a day. Historical documents from across pre-industrial Europe reference this pattern with such casual frequency that it clearly required no explanation for the people living it. Legal depositions mention events occurring after first sleep. Diaries record prayers said during the wakeful interval between sleeps. Medical texts offer advice on how to use this midnight wakefulness productively. Literature from Chaucer to Dickens contains references to first sleep and second sleep, dropped casually into narratives without definition, because every reader understood exactly what these terms meant. This was not an oddity or a quirk, but the standard human sleep pattern, woven into the fabric of daily life for thousands of years, until the late 19th century swept it away with electric light and factory schedules. So you lie down for first sleep in your Victorian bed, surrounded by heavy curtains that trap your breath and body heat, creating a warm, humid cave within the cold darkness of the bedroom. Your body, trained by a lifetime of this rhythm, slides easily into sleep despite the early hour. You sleep deeply for approximately 4 hours, which brings you to around midnight or 1 in the morning, and then you wake. Not to an alarm, not startled by noise or worry, but naturally, smoothly, your consciousness surfacing from sleep as gently as a swimmer rising from deep water. This waking is not insomnia. It is not a problem to be solved or a disorder to be treated. It is simply the space between first sleep and second sleep, as ordinary and expected as the afternoon, a time that has its own particular character and uses. You lie there in the darkness, or perhaps you light a single candle if you can afford to do so, and you inhabit this strange quiet hour that belongs neither to yesterday nor tomorrow, but exists in its own liminal space. What did the Victorians do during this period of wakefulness that divided their night in half? Historical records reveal a surprising variety of activities, all conducted in whispers and dimness, preserving the sense of night's special quality even during consciousness. Many people prayed during this time, considering the hour between sleeps particularly appropriate for communion with the divine. The household was quiet, the day's distractions had dissolved, and the mind was cleared of the clutter that usually obscures spiritual matters. Prayer books contained specific devotions meant for these midnight hours, acknowledging that this time existed and should be used meaningfully. Others used the interval for reflection, thinking through the day's events with a clarity impossible when consciousness is cluttered with immediate demands. Problems that seemed insurmountable in daylight sometimes revealed solutions during this quiet meditation. Relationships that felt strained could be examined with distance and perspective that transformed understanding. Couples made love during this interval, finding in the darkness between sleeps a privacy impossible during the day, when servants moved through rooms and children required constant attention. The bed was already warm, bodies already relaxed from first sleep, and there was no rush, no pressure to hurry toward rest that was still hours away. Some people simply lay thinking, their minds wandering through memories and imaginings with a freedom that daytime thinking rarely permits. The quality of consciousness during these midnight hours was different from both waking daytime awareness and sleeping dreams, something in between, a soft, unfocused state where thoughts drifted like smoke and the boundary between internal and external became pleasantly blurred. This was a time for reading by candlelight, for those wealthy enough to afford both candles and books. The silence and isolation made concentration deeper. Words absorbed during these hours seemed to penetrate more profoundly than the same words read in daylight, as if the sleeping mind that surrounded the small wakeful consciousness somehow participated in the reading. Neighbors sometimes visited each other during this interval, particularly in rural areas where houses stood close together and social conventions were relaxed by darkness. A gentle knock on the door, a whispered conversation on the doorstep, perhaps entering for a brief visit that would be concluded when sleep began to return. These nocturnal social calls had their own etiquette, their own understood rules that prevented them from becoming intrusive. The understanding was that first sleep had ended, but second sleep would come soon, so visits must be brief, voices must be low, topics of conversation must be suitable to the hour's contemplative quality. Some people ate light snacks during this time, though heavy meals were avoided. A piece of bread, some cheese, a cup of small beer or milk. The body was in a strange state between sleeping and waking, and food tasted different during these hours. Texture and flavor somehow heightened in the darkness. Children would sometimes wake during this interval and find their parents awake as well, leading to whispered conversations that felt different from daytime interactions. The darkness created intimacy and honesty. Questions asked in these hours received answers that might be avoided in daylight. Stories told between first sleep and second sleep had special power, transmitted from one generation to the next in this liminal time that belonged to neither yesterday nor tomorrow. Servants in their shared attic rooms would wake together and talk quietly among themselves, sharing confidences and complaints that could not be spoken during working hours. The rigid hierarchies of Victorian society softened slightly in the democratic darkness between sleeps, when everyone was equally reduced to a voice in the night. Then, as naturally as it had arrived, the wakefulness would begin to fade. You would feel sleep returning, a gentle heaviness in your limbs, your thoughts becoming less focused, your eyelids growing heavy despite your efforts to remain alert. This was the signal that second sleep approached, and you would extinguish your candle if you had lit one, settle back into your pillows, pull your blankets tighter against the cold, and let consciousness drift away again. Second sleep was different from first sleep, often described as deeper, richer, more filled with dreams. It would last until dawn, until natural light began to seep through curtains, or until the household stirred and woke you with sounds of morning preparation. You would rise feeling genuinely rested, having completed a natural cycle that gave your body and mind everything they needed from the night's darkness. This pattern persisted for centuries, until the Industrial Revolution and its attendant technologies disrupted rhythms that had seemed as permanent as the seasons. Gas lighting became affordable, then electric light transformed night into artificial day. Factory work required shifts around the clock, demanding workers who could labor at any hour, rather than following natural sleep patterns. Gradually, consolidated sleep became the norm, a single, unbroken block considered more efficient for industrial society's needs. The transition happened over decades, roughly from 1820 to 1880, with rural areas clinging longer to old patterns while cities adopted new ones. By the end of the Victorian era, segmented sleep had become a forgotten curiosity, something grandparents might remember but young people had never experienced. The night that had once been divided became unified, and the wakeful interval between sleeps vanished from human experience as completely as if it had never existed. Yet perhaps it was never truly erased, but merely suppressed, waiting beneath the surface of our consolidated sleep like bones beneath soil. Modern sleep researchers studying people removed from artificial light have discovered that segmented sleep returns naturally within weeks, suggesting that our bodies remember patterns our culture has forgotten. People who wake after 4 hours and lie awake, worrying that they have insomnia, might simply be experiencing the interval between first sleep and second sleep, their biology asserting ancient rhythms in a world that no longer acknowledges them. The Victorians were the last generation to live comfortably in both worlds, to remember segmented sleep while adapting to consolidated rest. They stood at the threshold of our modern relationship with darkness, and in understanding how they slept, we might discover truths about rest that electric light has taught us to forget. There is something primally unsettling about darkness that carries sound but no light, about air that moves against your skin without visible cause, about the sensation of being touched by something you cannot see. The Victorians understood this unease intimately, but they transformed it from vague discomfort into specific terror, backed by what they believed was scientific certainty. They called it the miasma theory, and it taught them that invisible poisons rode on every breath of night air, that opening a window after sunset was inviting death into your bedroom, that the darkness itself was not merely an absence of light, but a presence of malevolence. This fear shaped Victorian architecture, sleeping arrangements, medical advice, and even government policy in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds accustomed to sleeping with windows cracked for fresh air. Yet their terror was not irrational superstition, but logical conclusion, drawn from the best scientific understanding of their time, a reminder that rational people can be utterly wrong while following evidence that seems unassailable. The miasma theory had ancient roots stretching back to Greek and Roman medicine, but it reached its fullest expression in 19th century Britain as doctors and public health officials struggled to explain epidemic diseases that swept through cities with terrifying regularity. Cholera arrived in waves, killing thousands in weeks, turning healthy people into corpses so quickly that entire families could be wiped out between breakfast and dinner. Tuberculosis, that wasting disease they called consumption, seemed to pass between people through mysterious invisible means, slowly draining life from its victims until they became transparent ghosts of their former selves. Typhoid fever, smallpox, scarlet fever, and countless other afflictions struck without warning or pattern, respecting neither wealth nor virtue in their selection of victims. Faced with these inexplicable horrors, Victorian doctors developed a theory that explained everything. Disease was carried by bad air, by miasma, by invisible vapors that rose from decomposing matter, stagnant water, and human waste. These poisonous clouds, too subtle to see but potent enough to kill, drifted through cities and countryside, entering homes through windows and doors, seeping through walls and floorboards, bringing sickness wherever they touched living flesh. The theory seemed to fit the evidence perfectly. Diseases did cluster around areas with bad smells, where sewage ran in open gutters and garbage rotted in courtyards. The poorest neighborhoods, where sanitation was worst and odors were strongest, suffered highest mortality rates. Hospitals reeked of suppurating wounds and unwashed bodies, and patients died in shocking numbers despite medical care. Swamps and marshlands, which produced terrible stenches, were universally acknowledged as unhealthy places where fevers thrived. The connection between foul odor and disease seemed obvious, and the miasma theory provided elegant explanation. Smell was not merely a byproduct of decay, but the mechanism of disease transmission itself. Breathe deeply of rotting matter, and you inhaled poison. Stand downwind of a cemetery, and corpse vapors entered your lungs. The theory even explained why some people sickened while others remained healthy when exposed to the same conditions. Individual constitution varied, some bodies more susceptible to miasmic corruption than others. It was comprehensive, logical, supported by observational evidence, and completely wrong. But the Victorians did not know it was wrong, so they took elaborate precautions to protect themselves from the invisible aerial poison they believed pervaded their world. And nowhere were these precautions more extreme than in the bedroom, where people spent 8 or more hours in vulnerable unconsciousness, unable to detect danger or defend themselves if poisonous vapors crept through their windows. The Victorian solution was to seal the bedroom as completely as possible, transforming sleeping spaces into fabric tombs that trapped body heat and breath, but theoretically excluded the deadly night air. Heavy curtains surrounded beds on all sides, hanging from wooden or metal frames that created a private chamber within the larger bedroom. These curtains were not decorative but defensive, made from thick velvet or wool that could be drawn completely closed, eliminating every gap through which air might flow. Windows were shut tight before sunset and remained closed until morning light had presumably neutralized the night's poisons. Some families went further, stuffing cloth into the cracks around window frames, sealing keyholes with wax, blocking fireplace flues to prevent backdrafts that might draw contaminated outdoor air into sleeping rooms. The result was sleeping environments that were hot, stuffy, humid, and reeking of human exhalation. But the Victorians considered this preferable to the alternative. They genuinely believed that breathing fresh night air would sicken or kill them, that invisible death waited just beyond their windows, that every unsealed crack was a potential entrance for disease. Medical advice manuals reinforced these fears with stern warnings about the dangers of drafts and night vapors. Doctors instructed patients to sleep in rooms with minimal ventilation, to keep their heads covered even within the bed curtains, to avoid breathing cold air directly, to ensure that bedroom temperatures remained warm throughout the night because cold itself was thought to weaken the body's defenses against miasmic infection. Some physicians recommended placing bowls of vinegar or burning aromatic herbs in bedrooms before sleep, believing that these strong scents would either neutralize or drive away disease-bearing vapors. Others suggested sleeping with mouths closed and breathing only through the nose, which was thought to filter air more effectively than direct inhalation through the mouth. The irony, of course, is that the Victorians were creating exactly the conditions in which airborne diseases thrive. Tuberculosis, which they feared so desperately, spreads most efficiently in poorly ventilated spaces where infected people breathe the same air repeatedly, where moisture hangs in the atmosphere and bacteria can survive in tiny droplets suspended between exhalations. By sealing themselves in stuffy bedrooms, by sleeping in curtained enclosures where the same air circulated endlessly, they were manufacturing perfect incubators for the very diseases they hoped to avoid. Fresh air and sunlight are among the most effective weapons against many pathogens, but the miasma theory taught the opposite, that outdoor air carried danger while stale indoor air was safe. An entire society was suffocating itself in the name of health, following scientific advice that was killing them slowly, while they believed it was keeping them alive. Hospitals embodied this tragic error on an institutional scale. Victorian hospital wards were designed with minimal ventilation because medical authorities believed that admitting outdoor air would spread disease among vulnerable patients. Windows remained closed or opened only briefly during daytime hours when sunlight was thought to purify the air. The result was institutions that reeked of infection, where mortality rates were so high that many people preferred to die at home rather than risk entering a hospital. Yet because the miasma theory explained these deaths as resulting from the concentration of disease vapors within the hospital rather than from lack of fresh air, the response was to seal buildings even more tightly, to fumigate wards with harsh chemicals, to focus on eliminating odors rather than improving circulation. Not until the late 19th century, when germ theory gradually replaced miasma theory, did hospitals begin to understand that ventilation was protective rather than dangerous, that opening windows saved lives instead of threatening them. The transition from miasma theory to germ theory happened slowly, fought at every step by doctors and officials who had built careers on the old understanding and could not easily accept that their fundamental assumptions about disease were wrong. Even after Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch demonstrated that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases, many physicians clung to the belief that bad air was the primary culprit, that germs were secondary factors or even consequences rather than causes of illness. The debate raged through the 1870s and 1880s, with evidence accumulating on both sides, but interpretation remaining contentious. Victorian bedrooms gradually opened their windows as understanding shifted, though the change happened unevenly across social classes and geographic regions. Working-class families who had never been able to afford heavy bed curtains or well-sealed windows discovered retroactively that their poverty had protected them from fashionable practices that worsened health. The wealthy, who had invested fortunes in creating perfectly sealed sleeping chambers, learned that they had been suffocating themselves in luxury. By the 1890s, fresh air had been rehabilitated from poison to cure, and doctors began prescribing open windows and outdoor sleeping as treatments for tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. Sleeping porches became fashionable among those who could afford them, screened enclosures attached to houses where patients could rest, surrounded by moving air regardless of weather. Sanatoriums built for tubercular patients emphasized ventilation above all else, with wards designed to maximize airflow and patients encouraged to sleep with windows open even in winter. The pendulum had swung completely in the opposite direction, from paranoid ceiling to enthusiastic exposure, though this new approach was based on better and produced demonstrably better outcomes. The night air that had terrified the early Victorians became, by the end of their era, a valued therapeutic agent. Yet we should not mock them too harshly for their errors. They were trying desperately to understand and prevent suffering in a world where medicine was still emerging from centuries of superstition and ignorance, where epidemic disease killed without mercy or explanation, where any theory that offered hope of control was seized upon gratefully. The miasma theory was wrong, but it led to important public health reforms. Cities began removing garbage, cleaning streets, installing sewage systems, and eliminating standing water, all in efforts to reduce bad odors and the diseases they supposedly carried. These measures worked, dramatically reducing illness and death, but not for the reasons the Victorians believed. They were eliminating breeding grounds for mosquitoes and removing vectors for diseases like cholera that actually spread through contaminated water rather than through air. Right action based on wrong theory, success achieved despite fundamental misunderstanding. The night air never poisoned anyone, but the fear of night air paradoxically improved public sanitation and ultimately saved countless lives through mechanisms its believers never understood. Privacy, that luxury we take for granted in our individual bedrooms, with their lockable doors and walls that muffle sound, was a fantasy for most Victorians, an impossible dream as distant as owning a carriage or traveling to the moon. The vast majority of people in 19th century England slept in shared beds, their nights spent pressed against the warm bodies of siblings, servants, fellow travelers, or sometimes complete strangers, whose breath warmed their necks and whose movements disturbed their sleep. A bed was not a personal sanctuary, but communal furniture, a practical solution to the twin problems of cold and expense, and the modern notion that each person deserves their own sleeping space would have seemed absurdly wasteful to people who understood that survival often depended on sharing warmth through long winter nights, when frost formed on the inside of windows and morning water froze solid in wash basins. To understand Victorian sleep is to recognize that most people never experienced the solitude we consider normal, that their nights were spent in intimate physical proximity to others, whether they desired that closeness or not. In working-class homes, where space was measured in precious square feet and every room served multiple purposes, entire families often slept in a single room, sometimes in a single bed. A typical scenario might include parents sleeping with their youngest children, while older children shared another bed or slept on straw mattresses on the floor. In especially cramped conditions, beds might be used in shifts, with workers on night schedules sleeping during the day in the same beds their family members would occupy at night, the sheets never quite cooling between occupants. The bed itself was often the household's most valuable possession, a substantial piece of furniture that represented significant investment and was passed down through generations. Its frame sturdy enough to support multiple bodies, its mattress stuffed with whatever materials families could afford, from horsehair and wool for the relatively prosperous to straw and rags for the desperately poor. Children grew up understanding that personal space was a fantasy, that their bodies would be pressed against siblings throughout the night, that kicking or thrashing would earn sharp words or sharper elbows, that learning to sleep while touching others was simply part of being human. Servants in great houses experienced communal sleeping in its starkest form, their status reflected in how many bodies shared their beds and how cold their rooms remained through winter nights. Female servants typically slept in attic rooms, often 3 or 4 to a bed, arranged like spoons in a drawer to maximize warmth and minimize space. The rigid hierarchy of domestic service determined sleeping arrangements with the same iron certainty that governed every other aspect of their lives. The housekeeper might have her own small room, a privilege that marked her, Elevated status. The lady's maid perhaps shared with only one other person. But the lowly scullery maid, the girl who scrubbed pots and emptied chamber pots, would sleep squeezed between other servants in beds that sagged dangerously under the weight of multiple bodies, in rooms so cold that ice formed on the washstand, and breath hung visible in the air. Male servants slept in similar conditions, often in spaces above stables where the body heat of horses below provided marginal warmth, but also brought the constant smell of manure and the sounds of large animals moving in darkness. These communal sleeping arrangements created intimacies and tensions that shaped servants' lives in ways their employers rarely considered. Young women fresh from country villages, already terrified by the overwhelming complexity of urban service, found themselves sharing beds with strangers whose habits might be clean or filthy, whose personalities might be kind or cruel, whose bodies might be healthy or diseased. There was no escape, no possibility of solitude, no moment when you were not pressed against someone else's flesh, breathing someone else's exhalations, feeling someone else's movements transmit through the mattress. Some formed deep friendships through these forced proximities, creating bonds that lasted lifetimes, sharing whispered confidences in darkness that could never be spoken in daylight. Others developed fierce resentments, grievances that festered through months of unwanted contact, trapped in relationships they could not escape without losing their employment entirely. The bedmate who snored, who tossed and turned, who brought bedbugs from previous employment, who stole blankets or occupied more than her fair share of mattress space, became the focus of bitter complaint in servants' halls. But at least servants knew their bedmates, shared employment, and sometimes shared origins with the people pressed against them in darkness. Travelers faced the prospect of sleeping with complete strangers, a common practice at inns and taverns where bed space was sold by the body rather than by the room. If you arrived at a coaching inn during a busy period and requested a bed, the innkeeper would direct you to a room where other travelers already slept, and you would climb under the covers alongside whoever happened to be there, your only protection. The night clothes you wore, and the hope that your companions were relatively clean and honest. Theft was common in these circumstances, with travelers sleeping with their money pouches tied around their necks or their arms through the handles of their bags. Disease transmission was inevitable, with typhoid, tuberculosis, and various fevers passing easily between strangers who shared bedding and breathed each other's air through the night. Guidebooks for travelers offered detailed advice on how to protect yourself when forced to share beds with strangers. Sleep in your clothes if possible, keep valuables on your person, position yourself near the wall rather than the open side of the bed, avoid touching your bedmates any more than necessary. The strangers you might find yourself sleeping beside could be anyone, from respectable merchants to criminals fleeing justice, from young women traveling alone to elderly farmers heading to market. Class hierarchies that governed every other aspect of Victorian life dissolved somewhat in the communal beds of coaching inns, where lack of space forced unlikely bedfellows together. You might find yourself pressed against someone whose accent marked them as far above or far below your own station, whose hygiene standards differed dramatically from yours, whose snoring kept you awake despite exhaustion from a day of travel. Some travelers paid premium rates for private rooms, but this luxury remained beyond the reach of most people, who accepted shared beds as simply the cost of travel, an inconvenience no more remarkable than muddy roads or poor food. Letters and diaries from the period mention these arrangements casually, suggesting that contemporary shock at the practice would have puzzled Victorians who considered it entirely normal. Children in orphanages and workhouses experienced the bleakest forms of communal sleeping, warehoused in institutions that housed hundreds in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Workhouse beds might hold 4 or 5 children, all underfed, many diseased, pressed together for warmth in rooms heated minimally, if at all. Orphanages operated on similar principles, with the youngest children often sleeping 3 or 4 to a narrow bed designed for one adult. Disease swept through these institutions regularly, killing children by the dozen, and part of the reason was the impossibility of isolation, the fact that sick children continued sleeping, pressed against healthy ones because there was simply nowhere else to put them. Morning frequently brought the discovery that one of your bedmates had died during the night, their body cooling beside you while you slept. And the matter-of-fact way that Victorian records mention these deaths suggests how routine they had become. A childhood spent sleeping, surrounded by other children, never experiencing the sensation of a bed to yourself, never knowing the privacy of your own thoughts in your own space, shaped generations of Victorians in ways that are difficult for modern psychology to fully comprehend. Yet there were benefits to this enforced proximity that we have lost in our isolated modern bedrooms. Body heat saved lives during winters that could kill through cold alone, and the collective warmth of multiple bodies under shared blankets was often the only thing standing between survival and death by freezing. The psychological comfort of another human presence, the reassurance that you were not alone in darkness, helped children face fears that solitary sleeping might have made unbearable. The intimacy of shared sleep created bonds and understanding between siblings, between servants, between friends, that our more isolated existence makes difficult to replicate. Morning conversations began before anyone left the bed, with whispered discussions and shared laughter that eased the transition from sleep to waking. The Victorians understood something that our individualistic culture has forgotten, that human beings are social animals who derive comfort from proximity to others, that the touch and presence of other bodies can be protective rather than intrusive, that community includes the vulnerability of sleeping together in shared space. By the end of the Victorian era, changing social attitudes and improving economic conditions were beginning to shift sleeping arrangements toward the individual beds we now consider normal. Child development experts started arguing that children needed privacy for healthy psychological growth. Public health officials linked communal sleeping to disease transmission and recommended individual beds. Rising living standards made it economically feasible for more families to afford separate beds for each person. The transition happened gradually, unevenly, with working classes clinging longer to communal arrangements, while the wealthy pioneered the separate bedrooms that would eventually become universal. But for most of the 19th century, sleeping alone was an aberration, a privilege so rare that most people never experienced it. And the ghosts that haunted Victorian beds were not supernatural, but simply the warm bodies of strangers and family members breathing beside you in darkness, reminding you that solitude was a luxury reserved for the dead. Imagine walking into a Victorian photographer's studio and seeing what appears to be a family portrait. Mother and father seated proudly with their 3 children arranged around them, everyone dressed in their finest clothes, faces solemn in the manner of people who must hold still for long exposures. Look closer, though, and you will notice something wrong with the smallest child, a little girl perhaps 4 years old, held upright between her parents. Her eyes are open, but wrong somehow, the pupils not quite focused, the gaze fixed on nothing. Her skin has a waxy quality that the other family members lack, a smoothness too perfect, too still. The truth reveals itself slowly, uncomfortably. The child is dead. Her eyes painted open by the photographer's careful brush, her body positioned and propped to create the illusion of life for this one final portrait. This was not cruelty, but love, not macabre spectacle, but desperate tenderness. The Victorian attempt to capture and preserve what death was stealing, to create a memory that would last when the body itself was returned to Earth and began its transformation into something unrecognizable. Post-mortem photography, the practice of photographing the recently deceased, emerged in the 1840s almost immediately after photography itself became commercially available. And for the next 60 years, it was so common that virtually every family of means would have at least one death portrait among their possessions. The motivations were both practical and emotional, rooted in the peculiar intersection of Victorian death culture and the revolutionary new technology that could freeze moments in permanent form. Photography in its early decades was expensive, requiring specialized equipment, dangerous chemicals, and skilled practitioners who commanded substantial fees for their services. Most families could not afford to have portraits taken regularly, could not document the growth of their children or the passage of years through photographic records that we now take for granted. But when death arrived, suddenly the expense became justified. the cost acceptable, because this would be the only portrait, the single chance to preserve the face and form of someone who would otherwise vanish completely from visual memory. Better to have one photograph of a child in death than no photograph at all. Better to capture that face, even in stillness, than to rely solely on fallible memory that would blur and fade with years. The photographs themselves reveal the elaborate efforts photographers made to create convincing illusions of life, or at least of peaceful sleep. The deceased would be carefully positioned, dressed in their best clothes or sometimes in white burial garments that symbolized purity and innocence. Makeup was applied to restore color to faces that had begun to pale, rouge on the cheeks, tint on the lips, careful attention to details that would photograph well even if they looked slightly artificial in person. The eyes presented the greatest challenge, those windows to the soul that become so obviously vacant in death. Some photographers left the eyes closed, creating images that suggested sleep rather than death, the deceased appearing to rest peacefully, perhaps dreaming, perhaps merely tired. Others took the more unsettling approach of painting pupils directly onto closed eyelids, creating an eerie simulation of open eyes that fooled the camera even if it disturbed viewers who looked closely. The most elaborate productions involved special stands and frames hidden behind the body, metal supports that held the deceased upright and allowed them to be posed as if standing or sitting naturally, participating in family groups as they had in life. Infants and young children were the most frequent subjects of post-mortem photography, a reflection of the terrible infant mortality rates that made childhood death tragically common. In an era when 1 in 4 children died before their 5th birthday, when diseases like scarlet fever and diphtheria swept through neighborhoods claiming multiple young lives in single weeks, when the death of a child was expected rather than shocking, parents desperate to preserve some memory of their lost babies turned to photographers who specialized in this melancholy trade. The resulting images are heartbreaking in their tender attention to detail. Babies photographed in their cradles, surrounded by flowers, their tiny hands positioned to hold a favorite toy. Toddlers dressed in elaborate gowns, seated in chairs too large for them, their heads supported by hidden braces that kept them upright for the exposure. Older children posed with siblings who still lived, creating family portraits where death and life mingled in the same frame, where the living held very still to match the absolute stillness of the deceased. These photographs were treasured possessions, displayed in parlors, kept in locked cases, sometimes the only image the family would ever have of a child who had been part of their lives for such a brief time. The photographers who specialized in post-mortem work occupied a strange position in Victorian society, part artist, part mortician, part grief counselor. They would arrive at homes where death had recently visited, carrying their heavy equipment through streets where neighbors watched and understood immediately what the camera and black cloth signaled. Inside, they worked quickly but carefully, knowing that bodies had to be photographed within hours of death before decomposition began to alter features in ways that even makeup could not disguise. The process required technical skill and emotional steadiness, the ability to arrange dead bodies as if they were living subjects, to create compositions that would provide comfort rather than horror, to work surrounded by grieving families whose raw emotion filled the rooms where exposures were taken. Some photographers found this work unbearable and refused to accept commissions involving the deceased. Others built entire careers around death photography, becoming known for their sensitivity and skill, recommended by funeral directors and doctors, summoned to homes across cities and into the countryside whenever families needed this final service. The photographs served multiple purposes beyond simple remembrance. They were proof of having lived, evidence that this person had existed and mattered and was loved. They were objects of mourning, focal points for grief that needed somewhere to settle. They were, in their way, small rebellions against death's finality, attempts to steal back from mortality at least the image, if not the substance, of what had been lost. Families would commission multiple copies, sending prints to distant relatives who could not attend the funeral, distributing images that allowed extended family networks to participate in mourning despite geographic separation. The photographs were incorporated into elaborate memorial displays, surrounded by locks of hair, woven into jewelry or wreaths. by dried flowers from the funeral, by carefully preserved clothing or toys that had belonged to the deceased. These memorial assemblages transformed death into something tangible and manageable, contained within frames and cases that could be looked at or put away depending on the emotional needs of any given day. Modern viewers often recoil from these images, finding them morbid or disturbing, unable to understand how families could treasure photographs of deceased loved ones, how they could bear to look at these memento mori that we work so hard to avoid. But this reaction reflects our own culture's discomfort with death more than any excessive morbidity in the Victorians. They understood something we have forgotten, that death is part of life, that hiding it away in hospitals and funeral homes does not make it less real, that acknowledging mortality openly might be healthier than our modern pretense that death happens to other people in other places. The post-mortem photographs were honest, confronting loss directly, rather than euphemizing it into abstraction. Yes, this child is dead, the photograph said. Yes, we are heartbroken. Yes, we will never stop missing this person. But look, here is proof they existed. Here is their face preserved even in death. Here is evidence that they were real and loved and worthy of remembrance. The gentle lie was not that the deceased looked alive, not really, but rather the suggestion that photography could somehow make death less final, that capturing the image meant keeping some essential part of the person. By the end of the Victorian era, changing attitudes and improving photographic technology were making post-mortem photography less common. As cameras became more affordable and easier to use, families could take portraits during life, eliminating the need to wait for death to justify the expense. The development of faster film and shorter exposure times meant that photographing living people became simpler, while the deceased who could not hold still for long exposures lost their technical advantage. Cultural shifts toward viewing death as something to be hidden rather than displayed also reduced demand for death portraits that had once seemed natural and appropriate. The practice declined steadily through the 1890s and into the early 20th century, becoming gradually less common until it survived only in a few specialized contexts, primarily the photography of deceased infants whose parents had no other images. By the 1920s, post-mortem photography had become strange and vaguely shameful, something associated with an earlier era's morbidity rather than with appropriate mourning. The thousands of death portraits created during the Victorian decades were put away in attics, forgotten in dusty albums, sometimes destroyed by descendants who found them embarrassing or disturbing. But they remain, these last portraits, testimony to a time when people faced death directly, when love meant preserving the image of the beloved even in stillness, when photography served not to deny mortality, but to acknowledge it with unflinching tenderness. The woman standing before you is dressed entirely in black. But this is not the simple black of ordinary clothing, not the practical darkness of work dress or the elegant shadow of evening wear. This is mourning black, a specific shade called bombazine, a fabric woven from silk and wool that produces a dull, light-absorbing surface that seems to draw illumination from the air around it. Her dress is trimmed with black crepe, that crinkled material that rustles with every movement and leaves dark residue on whatever it touches, marking her physically with the grief she carries emotionally. Over her face hangs a thick veil of black crepe, so dense that her features are completely obscured, transforming her into a moving shadow, a ghost of herself, visible but not quite present in the world of the living. She is a widow in full mourning, and by looking at her dress, you can read her story as clearly as if it were written in ink. Her husband has been dead for less than a year. She is wealthy enough to afford proper mourning clothes, and she takes her social obligations seriously enough to follow every prescribed rule of grief's elaborate costume. Victorian mourning dress was not merely clothing, but a language, a system of communication that announced loss and demanded response from everyone who saw it. The rules governing mourning dress were extraordinarily complex, varying by relationship to the deceased, by gender, by social class, and by the amount of time that had passed since the death. These were not casual suggestions or personal preferences, but rigid social requirements enforced with the same iron certainty that governed every other aspect of Victorian propriety. Women bore the heaviest burden of visible mourning, their clothes transforming them into walking memorials, their bodies becoming public displays of private grief. A widow faced the longest and most severe mourning period, expected to withdraw from society for a full year of deep mourning, during which she wore only black in its most unrelieved form. Her dresses must be made of non-reflective fabrics, trimmed with black crepe that could be as wide as a person's hand, devoid of any ornamentation or decoration beyond what grief itself provided. Jewelry was forbidden, except for mourning jewelry made from jet, a fossilized wood that could be carved and polished to a black shine, or occasionally pieces containing the hair of the deceased woven into intricate patterns. The widow's veil was her most distinctive garment, a long piece of crepe that fell from her bonnet to below her waist, completely obscuring her face and marking her instantly as someone recently bereaved. After this first year of deep mourning, the widow could transition to second mourning, which lasted another 9 months and allowed slightly less severe dress. The crepe could be reduced in width, though it must still be present. The veil could be shortened to shoulder length and made from lighter material that permitted her features to be seen, though still veiled. Small amounts of white trim might be added to collars and cuffs, the first hint of light after a year of absolute darkness. During this second stage, the widow remained largely withdrawn from social life, attending only the most necessary functions and always in her mourning clothes that announced her continuing grief. Finally, after 21 months total, she could enter half mourning, a transitional period lasting another 9 months, during which she could wear gray, mauve, or purple, could add jewelry beyond mourning pieces, could begin tentatively to rejoin society. Only after 2.5 years total could a widow emerge from mourning entirely and wear ordinary colors again, though black remained appropriate, and many widows, especially older ones, simply continued wearing mourning for the rest of their lives, their wardrobes permanently transformed by a single death. Men faced far less demanding requirements, a disparity that reflected Victorian gender roles and assumptions about emotional expression. A widower was expected to mourn for only 3 to 6 months, and his mourning costume consisted primarily of a black suit, black gloves, and a black hatband or armband. He could continue his normal social and professional activities throughout this period, his grief acknowledged but not permitted to interfere with his functioning in the world. This double standard provoked occasional criticism even within Victorian society, with some observers noting the unfairness of expecting women to sacrifice years of their lives to visible mourning while men could return to normal activities within months. But the criticism rarely translated into changed practices, and women continued bearing the burden of performing grief on behalf of entire families, their bodies becoming the public face of loss, whether they felt the depths of sorrow their clothes suggested or not. The mourning requirements for other family relationships created a complex hierarchy of grief. Each level of kinship assigned its specific period and costume. For a parent or child, 1 year of mourning was required, though the stages and fabrics varied from those prescribed for widows. For siblings, 6 months of mourning at the longest, 4 months at the shortest, with specific rules about when white trim could be added and when half-mourning colors became acceptable. Grandparents rated 6 months to 4 months, depending on closeness of relationship. Aunts and uncles merited 3 months to 6 weeks. First cousins, 6 weeks to 1 month. Second cousins, 3 weeks if mourning was worn at all, which was optional. The precision of these requirements reveals the Victorian obsession with categorization and hierarchy, the need to measure and quantify even grief, to create social rules that governed every aspect of existence, including the expression of loss. The result was that women spent significant portions of their lives in mourning clothes, moving from one period of black to another as different family members died, sometimes overlapping multiple mourning periods when deaths occurred close together, their wardrobes dominated by dark fabrics, and their social lives permanently constrained by obligations to the dead. This elaborate system created an entire industry dedicated to mourning, a specialized economy that profited from death and grief. Mourning warehouses in major cities stocked only black fabrics and mourning accessories, employing seamstresses who could produce appropriate costumes quickly because deaths required immediate wardrobe changes. A family that received news of a death in the morning needed to be wearing mourning clothes by afternoon, which meant shops had to maintain large inventories of ready-made mourning garments in various sizes and styles. The expense was considerable, often catastrophic for working-class families who nonetheless felt compelled to mourn properly because failing to do so marked them as unfeeling or socially ignorant. Middle-class families might spend months of income on proper mourning clothes, and the pressure to maintain appearances meant that even families who could barely afford food felt obligated to purchase expensive bombazine dresses and crepe trim. Some families went into debt to mourn appropriately, borrowing money to buy clothes that would be worn for a prescribed period and then either stored away or dyed darker and repurposed. The funeral and mourning industry understood this desperation and exploited it, charging premium prices for goods that were urgently needed and socially mandatory. Mourning jewelry represented another significant expense and a particularly Victorian fusion of sentiment and commerce. Jet jewelry, carved from fossilized wood into brooches, earrings, necklaces, and bracelets, became enormously popular during Queen Victoria's long mourning for Prince Albert. The Queen's embrace of jet as appropriate mourning wear created a massive industry centered in Whitby, where jet deposits were mined and carved by skilled craftsmen. But even more intimate and personal than jet was hair jewelry, pieces created from locks of the deceased's hair, woven into intricate patterns, encased in lockets, braided into bracelets, or arranged in elaborate wreaths and framed as memorial art. The Victorians did not find this macabre, but rather beautiful and appropriate, a way of keeping the physical presence of the deceased close even after the body had been buried. Hair, unlike flesh, did not decay, and a lock carefully preserved could last indefinitely. A tangible connection to someone who had vanished in every other way. Women would wear brooches containing their husband's hair, mothers would braid deceased children's locks into rings, and extended families would create elaborate hair art, combining locks from multiple deceased relatives into patterns that represented family trees rendered in literal human remains. The most elaborate and expensive mourning jewelry incorporated multiple materials and sophisticated craftsmanship. Lockets might contain not only hair, but also miniature portraits of the deceased, painted on ivory or porcelain. Brooches combined jet with seed pearls to spell out words like mother or beloved, or were engraved with touching phrases about memory and loss. Rings were inscribed on the interior with names and dates, transforming everyday jewelry into memorial objects that announced grief to those who wore them and anyone who might examine them closely. This jewelry served multiple purposes. It was memorial, yes, but also social signal, conversation starter, and eventually inheritance, passed down through generations as family heirlooms that carried stories of loss and love. Modern sensibilities often recoil from wearing human hair or surrounding oneself with symbols of death, but the Victorians found comfort in these tangible reminders, preferring honest acknowledgement of mortality to the sanitized distance that modern culture maintains between living and dead. The question that inevitably arises is whether these elaborate mourning customs helped or hindered genuine grief, whether the rigid rules provided structure that supported the bereaved or imposed performative obligations that prevented authentic emotional processing. The answer, as with most complex human behaviors, is probably both. For some, the prescribed periods and required costumes offered clear guidance during a time when grief made decision-making impossible, providing a framework that carried them through the worst months of loss. The mourning, clothes announced their status to the world, ensuring that others knew to treat them gently, to offer condolences, to refrain from inappropriate cheerfulness in their presence. The stages of mourning created a gradual transition from deep grief back toward normal life, acknowledging that healing happened in steps rather than all at once. But for others, particularly women, trapped in years of enforced withdrawal from society, the mourning requirements became a prison, forcing them to perform grief long after their actual feelings had evolved, preventing them from moving forward with their lives when custom demanded they remain frozen in loss. The system allowed no variation for individual temperament or circumstance, no acknowledgement that people grieve differently, or that clothing cannot dictate emotion. A widow who felt relieved by her husband's death still wore the same black as one who was genuinely devastated, and both were judged by how perfectly they performed mourning regardless of what they actually felt. By the end of the Victorian era, these elaborate customs were already beginning to seem excessive, and the 20th century would sweep away most of these mourning requirements, leaving us with our modern discomfort around death and our uncertainty about how to dress grief or how long to acknowledge loss publicly before being expected to return to normal. Hold in your hand a Victorian brooch, its oval frame containing what appears at first glance to be intricate embroidery, brown and gold threads woven into delicate patterns that catch the light. Look closer, though, and the threads reveal themselves as something else entirely, something that makes modern skin crawl but made Victorian hearts swell with tender emotion. These are not threads at all, but human hair, locks carefully preserved from someone who has died, now braided and twisted and arranged into artistic designs that transform mortality into ornament. The woman who wore this brooch carried her dead child against her breast, the physical remnant of a body that no longer existed, a tangible connection to someone who had vanished from the world but could still be touched, still be held, still be kept close through the alchemy of craft and grief. This was not macabre to Victorian sensibilities, but beautiful, not disturbing, but comforting. A practice so common that virtually every family of means possessed at least one piece of jewelry containing hair from deceased loved ones, and many possessed entire collections that documented family history through the preserved strands of the dead. The tradition of keeping hair as memorial predated the Victorian era by centuries, but the 19th century transformed this ancient practice into an elaborate art form and thriving industry. Hair possessed qualities that made it uniquely suited to remembrance. Unlike flesh, which decayed and disappeared, hair remained essentially unchanged after death, maintaining its color and texture indefinitely if properly preserved. A lock of hair cut from a child's head on the day of death would look virtually identical 50 years later, a permanence that seemed almost magical in an age when everything else about the deceased had vanished into earth or memory. Hair was intimate, growing from the body itself, carrying some essential quality of the person who had produced it. To wear someone's hair was to carry a piece of them, not symbolically but literally, actual cells that had once been part of their living form, now repurposed into ornament. The Victorians found profound meaning in this material connection, preferring the reality of preserved biological matter to abstract symbols or artistic representations. The creation of hair jewelry required specialized skills that some families possessed, but most purchased from professional craftspeople who advertised their services in newspapers and maintained shops in cities and larger towns. The simplest pieces involved locks of hair sealed behind glass in lockets or brooches, preserved but otherwise unaltered, sometimes accompanied by miniature portraits or inscriptions identifying the deceased. These were touching but relatively straightforward, requiring no particular artistry beyond careful preservation and attractive framing. More elaborate pieces involved weaving the hair itself into intricate designs, a process that demanded both technical skill and artistic vision. Hair would be sorted by color, cleaned carefully to remove any oils or residue, and then woven using specialized tools and techniques adapted from other textile crafts. The strands could be braided into simple patterns or worked into complex designs that incorporated multiple colors and textures, creating images of flowers, geometric patterns, or even words spelled out in carefully arranged locks. The most skilled craftspeople could weave hair so finely that the finished pieces resembled expensive lace or embroidery, their organic origins detectable only upon close examination. Mourning brooches were perhaps the most common form of hair jewelry, worn prominently on clothing where they announced both grief and connection. A typical brooch might feature a central design of woven hair surrounded by a gold or jet frame, sometimes incorporating seed pearls or other materials that added visual interest without detracting from the hair's centrality. The back of the brooch often contained inscriptions, identifying whose hair was preserved, with names and dates that documented the loss. Women might own multiple mourning brooches, changing which one they wore depending on whose memory they wished to honor on any given day. These pieces served as conversation starters, opportunities to speak about the deceased and keep their memory alive through shared stories. When someone noticed a brooch and inquired about it, the wearer could describe the person whose hair it contained, sharing anecdotes and memories that transformed the jewelry from mere ornament into narrative device, a physical prompt for verbal remembrance. Hair wreaths represented the most ambitious and elaborate form of hair art, large displays that combined locks from multiple deceased family members into complex compositions framed and hung on walls like paintings. These wreaths might take months or even years to complete, with new hair added as additional family members died, creating ongoing projects that documented family history through accumulated biological material. The wreaths were typically arranged in circular or oval patterns, with different family members' hair, creating distinct sections or flowers, each element carefully labeled so that viewers could identify which hair belonged to which person. Looking at a completed hair wreath was like reading a family tree, rendered in actual human tissue, a genealogy made tangible and visceral in ways that written documents or photographs could never achieve. These pieces were treasured family possessions, passed down through generations, sometimes continuing to accumulate new hair as later descendants died and their locks were added to the growing memorial. The process of collecting hair for jewelry began immediately after death, with family members carefully cutting locks before the body was prepared for burial. The hair would be tied with ribbon and labeled, often stored in special containers designed for this purpose until it could be sent to craftspeople or worked into jewelry by family members themselves. How-to manuals provided detailed instructions for creating hair jewelry at home, treating the craft as appropriate feminine accomplishment alongside embroidery and watercolor painting. Young women learned to weave hair as part of their education, practicing first on their own living hair before graduating to the memorial pieces they would create when death visited their families. The home production of hair jewelry served multiple purposes. It saved money, it provided occupation for grief that might otherwise be overwhelming, and it ensured that the handling of precious hair remained within the family, rather than being entrusted to strangers who might not treat it with appropriate reverence. Rings incorporating hair were particularly popular for widows and widowers, worn constantly as tangible reminder of lost spouses. These rings might feature a small compartment containing a coiled lock of hair visible through a crystal face, or they might incorporate hair woven directly into the ring's band, creating jewelry that literally encircled the finger with the deceased's physical presence. The inside of such rings typically carried inscriptions, names, and dates, and sometimes brief phrases about love and loss that transformed everyday jewelry into sacred objects. These rings were worn until they fell apart or until the wearer died and was buried with them, maintaining connection between living and dead that neither time nor decay could sever. Some particularly devoted widows and widowers had multiple rings made, one from their spouse's hair and others from children or parents who had died, their fingers decorated with entire collections of the dead. Each ring a story and a connection, each piece of jewelry a relationship maintained beyond death's supposed finality. Bracelets woven entirely from hair represented another popular form, particularly for women who had lost children. A mother might have a bracelet made from her deceased daughter's hair, wearing it every day as both memorial and comfort, running her fingers over the braided strands when grief felt particularly acute. These bracelets could be quite long and elaborate, incorporating decorative clasps made from gold or other metals, but consisting primarily of the hair itself, transformed through weaving into something resembling silk cord or fine rope. The weight of such a bracelet on the wrist provided constant physical reminder of the person it represented, a sensation that became so familiar that removing the bracelet would feel like a second loss, like letting go of the deceased once more. Some women wore multiple bracelets simultaneously, their arms decorated with the hair of various lost family members, carrying their dead with them always in the most literal possible way. The Victorian hair jewelry tradition gradually declined in the early 20th century as changing attitudes made the practice seem morbid rather than touching, as modern sensibilities began to prefer distance from death's physical reality rather than the intimate engagement the Victorians had practiced. Photography provided alternative means of remembrance that seemed less visceral, less demanding of actual bodily connection. The elaborate mourning customs that had supported and encouraged hair jewelry began to seem excessive, and wearing human hair fell out of fashion along with the black bombazine dresses and extended mourning periods that had defined Victorian grief. Many pieces of hair jewelry were discarded by descendants who found them disturbing, destroyed because later generations could not understand the tender sentiment that had motivated their creation. Others survive in museums and private collections, strange artifacts from an era that understood mourning differently, that found comfort in physical connection to the dead rather than the sanitized distance modern culture prefers. Looking at these pieces now, we might see morbidity where the Victorians saw love, but perhaps we have lost something valuable in our rejection of their practices, some honest acknowledgement of mortality and connection that our more squeamish age cannot quite achieve. The hair woven into these brooches and rings and bracelets belonged to real people who were genuinely mourned, and the jewelry itself represents not macabre fascination with death, but rather its opposite, the fierce determination to keep some tangible connection to those who had been loved and lost, to refuse to let death have the final word, to insist that love persists in whatever forms we can create, even if those forms are as strange and unsettling as jewelry woven from the dead. The most fashionable colour in Victorian England was a shade of green so vivid, so luminous, that it seemed to glow with inner light, a colour that captured the essence of spring leaves and tropical parrots and precious emeralds all at once. Women coveted dresses in this particular green. Decorators insisted on wallpaper in this shade. Manufacturers produced everything from artificial flowers to children's toys in this brilliant hue. It was called Shields green or Paris green, or sometimes simply emerald, and it was so popular that entire rooms were decorated in nothing but variations of this single color, creating environments that seemed to pulse with verdant life. But this beautiful green had a secret, one that everyone knew yet somehow chose to ignore. It was made from arsenic, one of the deadliest poisons known to humanity, and it was slowly killing the people who surrounded themselves with it, who wore it against their skin, who breathed its dust with every movement, who touched it with bare hands, and then ate their dinners without washing. The Victorians danced with death dressed in green, and they did so willingly, knowingly, unable to resist beauty even when beauty was demonstrably lethal. Arsenic had been used as a pigment since ancient times, but the particular shades developed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were unprecedentedly brilliant, achieved through chemical processes that bound copper and arsenic into stable compounds that could be mixed with paint, dye, or adhesive. The resulting colors were unlike anything produced through vegetable dyes or mineral pigments, possessing an intensity and purity that made traditional greens look dull by comparison. When Scheele's green was first developed in 1775 by Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, it quickly became the most sought-after pigment in Europe, and by the Victorian era it had been refined into even more brilliant forms, including Paris green, which contained even higher concentrations of arsenic. Manufacturers incorporated these pigments into every imaginable product, and consumers bought them eagerly, seduced by color so vivid it seemed almost magical, willing to overlook the persistent rumors about sickness and death that followed arsenic green wherever it appeared. Wallpaper represented the most insidious form of arsenic exposure because it transformed entire rooms into poison chambers where people spent hours daily breathing air contaminated with arsenic particles. Victorian wallpaper was applied with paste that contained arsenic as a preservative, and the paper itself was often printed with arsenic-based pigments, creating layers of poison pressed against walls throughout homes. In humid conditions, or when mold grew on the paste, fungi would break down the arsenic compounds into arsine gas, a volatile form of arsenic that dispersed into the air and was inhaled by anyone in the room. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning were vague and easily attributed to other causes: headaches, fatigue, stomach troubles, skin rashes, respiratory problems. Doctors rarely connected these complaints to wallpaper, and when they did, homeowners often refused to believe that something as beautiful as their wallpaper could be dangerous. The green was too lovely, too fashionable, too expensive to remove simply because of unproven theories about poison. Families slept in bedrooms, papered in arsenic green. Children played in nurseries decorated with poisonous patterns. Invalids convalesced in rooms where the very walls were making them sicker, and no one wanted to acknowledge the connection between decor and disease. Clothing posed an even more direct danger because fabric dyed with arsenic green rested directly against skin, allowing the poison to be absorbed through perspiration and contact. Ball gowns were particularly hazardous, with yards of fabric dyed in brilliant green, often decorated with artificial flowers also colored with arsenic, creating garments that were essentially poison wrappers disguised as fashion. Young women attending dances would perspire in their elaborate gowns, and the moisture would activate the arsenic, allowing it to leach through the fabric and be absorbed through their skin. They would return home with rashes, blisters, and mysterious illnesses, but fashion demanded suffering, and a little discomfort seemed acceptable price for beauty. Some women died from their green dresses, their deaths attributed to weak constitutions or mysterious female ailments rather than to the toxic fabric wrapped around their bodies. Seamstresses who worked with arsenic-dyed fabrics suffered even worse fates, spending hours daily handling the poisonous material, breathing its dust as they cut and sewed, their hands constantly contaminated with residue that they inevitably ingested when they ate their meals. These working women developed the full spectrum of arsenic poisoning symptoms: hair loss, skin lesions, nausea, nerve damage, eventually cancer and death, their bodies destroyed by the fashionable fabrics they created for wealthier women. Cosmetics represented another avenue for deliberate arsenic consumption, with women applying poison directly to their faces in pursuit of the pale, luminous complexions that Victorian beauty standards demanded. Arsenic had a peculiar effect on skin, initially making it appear clearer and more translucent, giving the face an otherworldly pallor that was considered attractive in an era when tanned skin signified outdoor labor and poverty. Arsenic wafers could be purchased from pharmacies, small edible tablets that women consumed regularly to achieve this ghostly beauty, dosing themselves with poison that accumulated in their bodies over months and years. The immediate effects seemed positive: clearer skin, brighter eyes, an ethereal quality that made them more attractive by contemporary standards. But the long-term consequences were horrific, with chronic arsenic poisoning causing hair loss, tooth decay, nerve damage, organ failure, and eventually death. Yet women continued buying and consuming arsenic wafers because beauty was worth the risk, because appearing attractive mattered more than long-term health, because Victorian society valued women's appearance over their well-being. Arsenical soaps promised to remove freckles and blemishes, and women scrubbed their faces with these poisonous products daily, absorbing arsenic through their skin while also breathing the fumes that rose from hot water mixed with arsenical compounds. Face powders contained arsenic to create that desirable pale finish, and women dusted, their faces liberally, breathing the poisoned powder with every application, getting it on their lips where it would be inevitably ingested. Hair dyes often contained arsenic, particularly those promising rich dark colors, and both men and women used these products regularly despite warnings from doctors about the dangers. The scalp is one of the most absorptive areas of the body, and arsenical hair dyes delivered poison directly into the bloodstream through the thousands of tiny blood vessels that feed hair follicles. But warnings were ignored, dismissed as overly cautious or simply false, because the alternative was accepting that the beauty products people relied upon were actually poisoning them, and that truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Food and drink were not exempt from arsenical contamination, though in this case the presence of arsenic was usually accidental rather than deliberate, a consequence of the widespread use of arsenic in other products contaminating the food chain. Arsenic was used as a pesticide in agriculture, leaving residues on fruits and vegetables that were then consumed by humans. It was added to beer and wine as a clarifying agent, creating drinks that looked clearer and more appealing but carried poison in every glass. Food coloring often contained arsenic, particularly green colorings used in confections and desserts, turning innocent treats into toxic snacks. Children's sweets might be colored with arsenic green, and the little hands that grabbed these candies would become contaminated with poison that was then transferred to mouths during eating or sucking thumbs. The cumulative effect of all these exposures, wallpaper and clothing and cosmetics, and food all contributing their small doses of arsenic, was a population chronically poisoned, suffering mysterious ailments that doctors could not explain, and society refused to acknowledge as consequences of the poisons people surrounded themselves with daily. The knowledge that arsenic was dangerous was not hidden or suppressed, but rather openly discussed and then deliberately ignored because fashion and convention outweighed safety. Newspapers published articles about deaths linked to arsenic green, particularly focusing on children who died in nurseries, papered with poisonous wallpaper, or women who suffered from their green ball gowns. Medical journals documented cases of arsenic poisoning and traced them to wallpaper, cosmetics, or clothing. Chemists testified before Parliament about the dangers of arsenical products, and some manufacturers even advertised their goods as arsenic-free, implicitly acknowledging that other products contained poison. Yet the fashionable continued wearing green, decorating with green, purchasing products in that luminous, deadly shade because it was beautiful, and because beauty mattered more than the abstract possibility of future harm. The Victorian calculus valued appearance over health, immediate gratification over long-term consequences, social conformity over individual safety, and arsenic green became the perfect symbol of this dangerous prioritization. By the 1880s and 1890s, growing public awareness and pressure from reformers began to reduce the use of arsenic in consumer products. Alternative pigments were developed that could approximate arsenic green without the toxicity, though none quite captured the same vivid glow. Wallpaper manufacturers started producing arsenic-free papers, and some even began printing their products with guarantees of safety, appealing to consumers who had become wary of poison in their homes. Fashion gradually shifted away from the brightest greens toward other colors, and the most lethal arsenical dyes fell out of favor. But the transition was slow and incomplete, and many Victorian homes remained papered in poison well into the 20th century, their occupants either unaware of the danger or unable to afford replacement, continuing to breathe arsenic until the paper finally deteriorated enough to be removed. The green dresses were packed away in attics, where they slowly released their poison into the air, and the cosmetics were discarded, but not before they had done their damage to generations of users. The Victorians had waltzed with arsenic for decades, and when the music finally stopped, they were left to count the cost in damaged health, premature deaths, and the bitter knowledge that they had prioritized beauty over life and lost both in the process. The bottle is small, made of dark glass to protect its contents from light, with a cork stopper and a handwritten label that promises relief from all manner of ailments. Inside swirls a liquid that looks like nothing more remarkable than strong tea, slightly viscous, reddish-brown, with a bitter medicinal smell that makes the nose wrinkle. This is laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and it sits on kitchen shelves throughout Victorian England alongside salt and sugar, as common and unremarkable as any other household necessity. The mother reaches for it multiple times daily, adding drops to water for her teething infant, mixing it into her own tea to calm her nerves, offering it to her husband when he complains of pain from his factory injury. None of them consider themselves opium addicts. None recognize the substance they casually consume as the same drug that reduces Chinese opium dens to dens of degradation in the newspapers. Laudanum is medicine, respectable and necessary, prescribed by doctors and purchased from chemists without question or restriction. And the fact that it contains one of the most addictive substances known to humanity seems irrelevant compared to its marvelous ability to make suffering disappear into soft, pleasant haze. Opium had been used medicinally for thousands of years, but the Victorians achieved something unprecedented. They made opium consumption so widespread, so normalized, so completely integrated into daily life that addiction became epidemic while remaining largely invisible. The key was transformation, turning raw opium from something exotic and foreign into familiar household products with innocent-sounding names and respectable purposes. Laudanum was the most common form, opium dissolved in alcohol, but there was also paregoric for children, Godfrey's cordial for infants, Dover's powder for various complaints, and countless other preparations that delivered opium in measured doses disguised as legitimate medicine. These products were not controlled substances requiring prescriptions or special handling. They were available at any chemist's shop, sold over the counter to anyone with money to purchase them, advertised in newspapers and magazines, recommended by doctors and grandmothers with equal enthusiasm. A typical Victorian household might have several opium-containing products in the medicine cabinet, each one deployed for different purposes, none of them recognized as variations of the same addictive drug. Infants and small children were perhaps the most heavily dosed members of Victorian society, their tiny bodies receiving regular administrations of opium from parents who believed they were providing appropriate medical care. Teething was considered a dangerous condition, requiring aggressive treatment, and opium-laced preparations were the go-to solution for babies suffering through the emergence of their first teeth. Mothers would administer drops of laudanum or paregoric to crying infants, watching with satisfaction as the drug took effect and the baby fell into quiet, motionless sleep. The child was not merely sleeping, but heavily sedated, sometimes to the point of stupor. But parents interpreted this drugged unconsciousness as healing rest and continued dosing regularly. Godfrey's cordial, one of the most popular infant remedies, contained enough opium to sedate adults, yet it was given to babies sometimes multiple times daily, creating tiny addicts before they could walk or talk. Working-class mothers who needed to labor in factories or fields found these opiates invaluable for keeping children quiet and manageable, and some would leave their babies in the care of others with instructions to administer cordial whenever the child fussed. The result was a generation of children raised on opium, their developing brains and bodies shaped by constant exposure to narcotics, their natural sleep patterns disrupted by drug-induced unconsciousness. Women bore particularly heavy burdens of opium consumption, both because Victorian medicine pathologized normal female experiences and because social constraints made laudanum one of the few acceptable outlets for managing the stresses of their constricted lives. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and menopause were all treated as medical conditions requiring aggressive intervention, and opium figured prominently in the treatments prescribed. Dysmenorrhea, or painful periods, was treated with laudanum. Morning sickness during pregnancy was managed with opium preparations. Labor pains were dulled with heavy doses that left women barely conscious during childbirth. The mysterious condition called neurasthenia, or nerve weakness, which encompassed everything from depression to anxiety to vague malaise, was treated almost exclusively with opiates that provided temporary relief but worsened the underlying problems. Victorian women trapped in lives of limited options, forbidden from working or pursuing education, confined to domestic spheres where boredom and frustration were constant companions, found in laudanum a socially acceptable escape. Taking medicine was respectable, even virtuous, evidence of feminine fragility that required constant pharmaceutical support. No one called it addiction when a lady took her daily dose of nerve tonic, even if she became unable to function without it, even if her consumption increased steadily over months and years, even if withdrawal symptoms appeared when the supply was interrupted. The symptoms of opium addiction were well known to medical professionals by the middle of the Victorian era, yet society seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge how widespread the problem had become. Doctors wrote articles in medical journals about the dangers of opium, describing the progression from therapeutic use to dependence, documenting the physical and psychological damage caused by prolonged consumption. They observed that patients developed tolerance, requiring ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effects. They noted the terrible suffering of withdrawal, the cramping and sweating and mental anguish that made stopping nearly impossible once addiction had taken hold. They recognized that opium dulled ambition and motivation, turning once productive people into listless shadows who lived only for their next dose. Yet these same doctors continued prescribing opium liberally, unable to offer effective alternatives for pain management or mental distress, unwilling to deprive patients of relief even when that relief came at the cost of addiction. The contradiction was glaring but rarely addressed. Everyone knew opium was dangerous, yet everyone continued using it because nothing else worked as well for the immediate purpose of making suffering disappear. The social acceptability of laudanum contrasted sharply with attitudes toward other forms of opium consumption, revealing the class prejudices and racial assumptions that shaped Victorian drug policy. When Chinese immigrants opened opium dens where the drug was smoked rather than taken medicinally, British society reacted with horror and moral panic, passing laws to restrict opium smoking while leaving laudanum completely unregulated. The distinction was arbitrary and hypocritical. Smoking opium and drinking laudanum both delivered the same drug to the brain, both created the same addiction, both produced the same harmful effects. But smoking was associated with foreign working-class vice, while laudanum consumption was middle-class, domestic, feminine, and therefore somehow more acceptable, despite being equally destructive. Newspapers published lurid accounts of opium dens as sites of depravity and degradation, while advertisements for laudanum-containing patent medicines appeared on the very next page, promising health and vigor through products that were fundamentally the same substance. The disconnect between perception and reality was maintained through elaborate social fiction that distinguished respectable pharmaceutical use from disreputable recreational consumption, even though the line between them was non-existent in practical terms. Poets and writers of the Victorian era famously used laudanum and other opiates, sometimes claiming that the drugs enhanced their creativity and provided access to imaginative realms unavailable to sober consciousness. Samuel Taylor Coleridge attributed his visionary poem Kubla Khan to an opium dream, though he spent much of his life struggling unsuccessfully to free himself from addiction. Thomas de Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a memoir that detailed both the pleasures and horrors of long-term opium use, describing the drug's ability to transform mundane experience into sublime beauty, while also documenting the devastating physical and mental deterioration that chronic use produced. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took laudanum for pain throughout her life, her poetry perhaps influenced by the dreamy dissociation the drug created. These literary associations gave laudanum a romantic aura, suggesting that opium opened doors to artistic inspiration and philosophical insight. But the reality for most users was far less glamorous. The vast majority of Victorian opium addicts were not visionary poets, but ordinary people who had started taking the drug for legitimate medical reasons and found themselves trapped by physical dependence they could not escape. Children born to addicted mothers arrived in the world already dependent on opiates, experiencing withdrawal symptoms that manifested as incessant crying, trembling, and feeding difficulties that often led to more opium being administered to quiet them. These babies faced lifelong health problems, their development compromised by exposure to narcotics, both in the womb and during infancy. The mortality rate among heavily dosed infants was shocking, with coroners regularly encountering cases where babies had been accidentally poisoned by well-meaning parents who administered too much laudanum or who failed to recognize that different products contained the same active ingredient. The deaths were usually attributed to natural causes or teething complications, rather than to drug overdose, because admitting the truth would have required acknowledging how casually Victorian society was poisoning its children. Better to maintain the fiction that these were tragic but unavoidable losses, rather than preventable deaths caused by a culture that had normalized infant sedation through powerful narcotics. By the end of the Victorian era, growing awareness of addiction's scope and damage led to the first attempts at regulation, though these came far too late for the millions who had already fallen into dependency. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required that opium-containing products be labeled and sold only by registered chemists, a modest reform that did little to restrict availability. Later regulations imposed further controls, and by the early 20th century, opium was finally recognized as a controlled substance requiring prescriptions for purchase. But the transition was slow and resisted by both industry and consumers who had grown accustomed to easy access. The legacy of Victorian opium use persisted for decades, with addiction rates remaining high well into the modern era. We look back now with horror at the casual way the Victorians dosed themselves and their children with narcotics, but our own era's struggles with prescription opioid addiction suggest we have not learned the lesson as thoroughly as we might wish. The names have changed and the regulations are stricter, but the fundamental pattern remains. Drugs that relieve suffering create dependency, and societies that prioritize immediate relief over long-term consequences find themselves trapped in cycles of addiction they cannot easily escape. The parlor has been transformed for this evening's gathering. Heavy curtains drawn against the last light of day, gas lamps turned low until shadows pool in every corner, and familiar furniture becomes strange, almost threatening in the dimness. Around a small circular table sit 6 people, their hands joined in a chain that must not be broken, their breathing synchronized in the close, stuffy air that smells of perfume and nervous perspiration. At the head of the table sits the medium, a woman dressed in flowing white robes, her eyes closed, her face composed in an expression of serene concentration. She has promised to summon the dead, to pierce the veil between this world and the next, to bring voices and messages from those who have departed but not, she assures her clients, truly left. This is a Victorian seance, part religious ceremony, part theatrical performance, part desperate attempt to make sense of loss that feels unbearable, and it is happening in parlors across England tonight, in middle-class homes and aristocratic mansions, wherever grief has created hunger for proof that death is not the end of relationship, not the final silence it appears to be. Spiritualism arrived in England from America in the 1850s, brought by traveling mediums who demonstrated table rapping, automatic writing, and spirit communication to audiences hungry for something that bridged the chasm between religious faith and scientific materialism. The movement claimed to offer empirical proof of the afterlife, evidence that could be observed and tested rather than simply believed on faith. If was revealing the mechanisms behind natural phenomena previously attributed to divine intervention, if the material world was being explained through physics and chemistry rather than theology, then perhaps death too could be investigated scientifically, its mysteries revealed through careful observation and experimentation. Spiritualism promised exactly this: a scientific approach to the supernatural, a way to study the afterlife with the same rigor that scientists studied electricity or magnetism or any other invisible force. The appeal was enormous, particularly to people who had lost faith in traditional religion, but still desperately wanted to believe that consciousness survived physical death, that the people they had loved and lost were not simply gone, but merely relocated to another plane of existence from which they could still communicate. The typical seance followed established patterns that varied only slightly between different mediums and different locations. Participants would gather in a darkened room, darkness being necessary because spirits were said to be weakened or repelled by bright light, particularly the harsh illumination of gas lamps. The medium would invite everyone to join hands around a table, creating an unbroken circle through which spiritual energy could flow. Silence would be requested, or sometimes participants would sing hymns or recite prayers to create the proper atmosphere for spirit visitation. The medium would enter a trance state, her breathing becoming deep and regular, her body sometimes trembling or convulsing as she claimed to be making contact with the spirit world. Then the phenomena would begin. Mysterious knocking sounds emanating from the table or walls, cold breezes blowing through sealed rooms, objects moving without visible cause, and most dramatically, voices speaking through the medium's mouth, claiming to be the spirits of the deceased come to deliver messages to the living. These voices would offer proof of their identity through knowledge of events or secrets known only to the deceased, and their surviving family members would provide comfort through assurances that death was peaceful and the afterlife was beautiful, would sometimes deliver warnings or advice about practical matters facing the living. Spirit photography emerged as another form of evidence that the dead remained accessible to proper investigation. Photographers claiming to capture images of ghostly figures hovering near living subjects, or appearing as translucent presences in portraits. The most famous spirit photographer was William Mumler, whose images showed clear human forms floating beside or behind his living clients, figures that were supposedly the spirits of deceased loved ones, made visible through the camera's unique ability to see what human eyes could not perceive. These photographs were treasured by believers, framed and displayed alongside portraits of living family members, accepted as proof that the dead watched over the living from whatever realm they now inhabited. The fact that many spirit photographs were later exposed as frauds, created through double exposure or other darkroom tricks, did little to diminish the faith of true believers, who simply argued that some mediums might be fraudulent, but that didn't prove all of them were, that the existence of counterfeit phenomena didn't disprove the existence of genuine spiritual contact. The most elaborate seances featured physical mediums who produced spectacular phenomena, including full-body materializations of spirits, ectoplasm streaming from their mouths or noses, levitation of furniture, or even of the medium herself, and apports where objects appeared from nowhere or disappeared into thin air. These performances drew large audiences willing to pay substantial fees for the privilege of witnessing such wonders, and the most successful mediums became celebrities, traveling internationally and holding seances for royalty and political leaders. Queen Victoria herself consulted mediums after the death of Prince Albert, desperate for some contact with the husband whose loss had devastated her, though whether she truly believed in their powers or simply found comfort in the ritual is debated by historians. The Queen's interest in spiritualism gave the movement tremendous social legitimacy, making seance attendance fashionable among the upper classes and encouraging middle-class families to host their own table-rapping sessions at home, using instruction manuals that explained how to summon spirits without professional medium assistance. Yet fraud was rampant, with investigators regularly exposing mediums who used tricks and confederates to create seemingly supernatural phenomena. Houdini, the famous magician, made it his mission to debunk fraudulent mediums, attending seances in disguise and then revealing how the effects were produced through stagecraft and deception. He showed how tables could be made to wrap through concealed mechanisms operated by foot pedals, how cold breezes were created by hidden bellows, how glowing ectoplasm was nothing more than cheesecloth, treated with luminous paint and concealed in body cavities to be dramatically produced at the appropriate moment. Spirit photographs were exposed as double exposures or images of living accomplices dressed in white sheets. The voices of the dead were revealed as ventriloquism or recordings played through hidden speaking tubes. Yet exposure of individual frauds never seemed to shake the faith of true believers, who argued that the tricks exposed were simply the desperate attempts of genuine mediums to produce phenomena on demand when their real powers temporarily failed, or that fraudulent mediums didn't disprove the existence of legitimate spiritual communication any more than counterfeit money disproved the existence of real currency. The psychology driving Victorian spiritualism's popularity was complex, rooted in the specific conditions of 19th century life that made death both ubiquitous and increasingly difficult to reconcile with emerging scientific worldviews. The high mortality rates, particularly among children, meant that virtually every family experienced profound loss, often repeatedly, often of young people in what should have been the prime of life. Traditional religious consolations about heaven and reunion after death were losing their power for many people, as scientific discoveries challenged biblical literalism and made traditional theology seem increasingly untenable. Yet the need for comfort, for some assurance that death was not absolute annihilation, remained as strong as ever, perhaps stronger because it was no longer supported by unquestioning religious faith. Spiritualism filled this void perfectly, offering what seemed like empirical evidence for survival after death, proof that could be witnessed and verified rather than accepted on faith alone. It allowed people to maintain connection with their dead through regular communication rather than passive hoping for eventual reunion in an afterlife that was becoming harder to believe in. The seance table became a place where grief could be processed, where the unbearable finality of death could be softened through ongoing relationship with the deceased. Women played particularly prominent roles in spiritualism, both as mediums and as participants, finding in the movement opportunities for authority and public activity that were denied them in other spheres of Victorian life. Female mediums claimed spiritual gifts that gave them power and status, allowed them to speak publicly and command attention in ways that would have been considered inappropriate in other contexts. The trance state provided cover for assertiveness that might otherwise be condemned, permitting women to deliver messages and pronouncements while claiming they were merely passive vessels for spirit communication. Some historians argue that spiritualism functioned as a kind of proto-feminism, giving women space to exercise agency and influence while maintaining the fiction that they were not really acting on their own behalf, but rather channeling external forces. The spirits who spoke through female mediums often delivered progressive messages about women's rights, social reform, and the artificial constraints of Victorian gender roles, messages that might have been dismissed as inappropriate if delivered by women speaking in their own voices, but gained authority when attributed to wise spirits from the afterlife. By the end of the Victorian era, spiritualism was beginning its slow decline, undermined by repeated exposures of fraud, by changing cultural attitudes, and by the simple fact that the promised scientific proof of the afterlife never quite materialized in forms that could withstand rigorous skeptical investigation. The movement never disappeared entirely, maintaining loyal followers well into the 20th century and beyond, but it lost the cultural centrality and respectable status it had enjoyed during its Victorian heyday. Yet its legacy persists in contemporary fascination with the paranormal, in the continued appeal of mediums and psychics who claim to communicate with the dead, in the comfort people still find in believing that consciousness survives bodily death, and that our departed loved ones remain accessible to those who know how to reach them. The Victorian seance table, with its joined hands and darkened room, and desperate hope for one more message from those who have gone ahead, represents something fundamentally human: the refusal to accept death as final separation, the insistence that love must be stronger than mortality, the need to believe that the voices we cherished in life might still speak to us from whatever lies beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. Picture yourself waking in absolute darkness, so complete that your open eyes see nothing, not even shadows. Your hands move instinctively upward and encounter wood mere inches from your face, smooth planks that form a box around your body. The air is thick and stale, already tasting of earth and decay, and when you try to sit up, your forehead strikes the coffin lid with a dull thump that sends pain shooting through your skull. You are not dreaming. You are not having a nightmare. You are awake, conscious, alive, and you have been buried 6 feet underground in a sealed casket from which there is no escape. This was the Victorian nightmare that haunted millions, a terror so visceral and so widespread that it spawned an entire industry dedicated to preventing the ultimate horror: premature burial. The fear was not irrational superstition, but based on genuine cases, real stories of people who had been declared dead and buried, only for evidence to emerge later suggesting they had been alive when the earth was shoveled onto their coffins. The Victorian era's intimacy with death created perfect conditions for this particular terror to flourish. Medical in the 19th century lacked the diagnostic tools we take for granted today. No electrocardiograms to measure heart activity, no brain scans to detect neural function, no sophisticated tests to distinguish coma from death or deep unconsciousness from final cessation. Doctors relied on crude methods, holding mirrors to the mouth to detect breath, feeling for pulses that might be too weak to find, observing for signs of decay that took hours or days to appear. Diseases like cholera, catalepsy, and various fevers could produce death-like states where breathing became so shallow as to be undetectable, where the heartbeat slowed to near imperceptibility, where the body cooled and stiffened in ways that mimicked rigor mortis. In an era when people died at home and were buried quickly, often within 24 hours of apparent death, the margin for error was terrifyingly thin. The possibility that someone might be declared dead prematurely was not paranoid fantasy, but real risk, and the Victorians knew it. Stories of premature burial circulated widely in newspapers and popular literature, each tale more horrifying than the last, feeding public anxiety and transforming rational concern into widespread panic. Reports described coffins opened years after burial to reveal bodies positioned as if the occupant had tried to claw their way out, fingernails embedded in the wooden lid, faces frozen in expressions of terminal agony. Gravediggers claimed to hear screaming from underground, though whether these stories were true or embellished for dramatic effect is impossible to determine. Medical journals documented cases of people reviving on mortuary slabs or during funeral preparations, suddenly sitting up or gasping for breath after being declared officially dead. Edgar Allan Poe's stories, particularly the Premature Burial published in 1844, captured and amplified these fears, describing in excruciating detail the psychological and physical horrors of waking in a coffin. The story became enormously popular, suggesting that Poe had tapped into a terror that resonated deeply with Victorian readers who recognized the scenario as plausible rather than purely fictional. The response to this widespread fear was characteristically Victorian. If technology and industry had created the modern world, then surely they could solve this problem too. Inventors and entrepreneurs began designing and marketing safety coffins, elaborate contraptions that would allow someone mistakenly buried to signal for help or escape on their own. The simplest devices involved strings or chains attached to bells mounted above ground, so that any movement inside the coffin would ring the bell and alert cemetery workers that the occupant needed immediate excavation. More sophisticated versions included speaking tubes that ran from the coffin to the surface, allowing the buried person to call for help and communicate with rescuers. Some designs incorporated air tubes to provide oxygen while rescue was being arranged, recognizing that even if the bell was heard immediately, digging down 6 feet would take time. The most elaborate safety coffins included escape hatches, ladders, or spring-loaded lids that could be opened from inside, theoretically allowing the prematurely buried to climb out on their own if they possessed sufficient strength and presence of mind. The safety coffin industry flourished through the latter half of the 19th century, with dozens of patents filed for various designs, each claiming to be more reliable than its competitors. Some systems were purely mechanical, operated by the buried person's movements triggering levers and pulleys. Others incorporated more advanced technology for the era, including pneumatic systems that used air pressure, electrical components that would activate alarms, or even pyrotechnic devices that would shoot fireworks into the air to attract attention. Advertisements for safety coffins appeared in newspapers alongside other funeral goods, pitched as essential purchases for anyone who wanted to ensure they would not suffer the ultimate indignity of being buried alive. The prices varied widely, from relatively affordable bells and strings to elaborate mechanisms that cost as much as the coffin itself. Some manufacturers offered installment plans, recognizing that fear of premature burial crossed class lines, and that even people of modest means might be willing to go into debt to purchase peace of mind. Cemetery workers were employed specifically to watch and listen for bells ringing from graves, walking the grounds at regular intervals, and paying special attention during the first few days after a burial, when any mistake would most likely become apparent. The phrase "saved by the bell" may have originated from this practice, though etymologists debate its true source. What is certain is that cemetery night watchmen took their duties seriously, knowing that any bell that rang represented someone's worst nightmare coming true, and that speed in responding could mean the difference between rescue and horrible death. The workers carried shovels and lanterns, ready to dig at a moment's notice, and some cemeteries maintained logs documenting every bell that rang, most of which turned out to be false alarms caused by wind, settling earth, or decomposition gases causing movement inside the coffin. The fascinating and somewhat darkly amusing reality is that despite the widespread use of safety coffins and elaborate alarm systems, there are no verified historical records of anyone being rescued from premature burial through these devices. Every bell that rang, when investigated, proved to be a false alarm. Every speaking tube, when checked, carried no voice from below. The coffins that were opened revealed only corpses in various states of decay, never a living person grateful for rescue. This does not mean that premature burial never happened. the evidence suggests that it probably did occur occasionally, but rather that the safety devices proved ineffective in practice. Someone genuinely buried alive would likely be in shock, disoriented, possibly injured by the original accident or illness that caused them to appear dead, and struggling to breathe in the limited oxygen available inside a buried coffin. The cognitive and physical demands of operating even simple bell mechanisms might be beyond the capabilities of someone in such circumstances. And if they did manage to ring the bell, would it be heard? Would anyone respond quickly enough? The grim mathematics of oxygen depletion inside a buried coffin suggested that even successful signaling might not lead to successful rescue. By the end of the Victorian era, improving medical diagnostic techniques were making premature burial less likely, though the fear persisted well into the 20th century. Doctors learned to wait longer before declaring death, to look for more definitive signs of mortality, to use more sophisticated tests for determining whether life remained. Embalming became more common, and while this practice served primarily to preserve bodies for viewing and funeral services, it also provided absolute certainty that the deceased was truly dead, since no one could survive having their blood replaced with chemical preservatives. Mortuaries began using waiting periods, keeping bodies under observation for days before burial, watching for any signs of revival. These practical medical advances did more to address the actual risk of premature burial than all the elaborate safety coffins ever manufactured, though the coffins captured public imagination in ways that sensible medical protocols never could. The Victorian fear of premature burial reveals something important about how that era understood death and consciousness. They recognized, perhaps more clearly than we do, how ambiguous the boundary between living and dead could be, how easily mistakes could be made, how much we rely on imperfect human judgment and inadequate technology to make the most final determination possible. Their elaborate coffin mechanisms and bell systems were attempts to maintain some agency even in death, to refuse absolute helplessness, to insist that if consciousness remained, it should have one last chance to assert itself. In our modern era of brain death criteria and sophisticated life support systems, we have different anxieties about death's boundary, but the fundamental fear remains the same: that we might be trapped in bodies others have decided are no longer alive, unable to communicate, unable to escape, conscious but presumed dead. The Victorian safety coffin, with its bell rope dangling into darkness and its speaking tube open to the earth above, represents the desperate hope that death's door might have a handle on both sides, that even from 6 feet under, a living voice might still be heard if anyone was listening. The dining room has been transformed, its normal cheerfulness subdued by black crepe draped over mirrors and portraits, by curtains drawn against daylight that seems too bright for a house of mourning. But the long table is laden with food, an abundance that seems almost obscene in its plenty. Cold meats and pies, cakes and biscuits, bread and cheese, fruits preserved from last summer's harvest, bottles of wine and ale waiting to be opened. In the adjoining parlor, visible through the open doorway, lies the coffin containing the body of the deceased, positioned so that it seems to preside over the gathering, a silent host at their own funeral feast. This juxtaposition of death and dining, of corpse and consumption, strikes modern sensibilities as grotesque. But for the Victorians, it was perfectly natural, even necessary, a ritual that transformed individual loss into communal experience, that fed the living while honoring the dead, that acknowledged mortality while simultaneously affirming life's continuation through the most basic human act of sharing food. The Victorian funeral feast, sometimes called the funeral breakfast or funeral tea, depending on the time of day, was an essential component of mourning ritual across all social classes, though its scale and elaboration varied dramatically based on family wealth. For the prosperous, the feast might include dozens of dishes, with professional caterers hired to prepare and serve food for hundreds of mourners. Multiple courses would be offered: soups and roasts, vegetables and salads, elaborate desserts, including the special funeral cakes that were traditional at such gatherings. The best china would be used, the finest linens spread on tables, servants moving quietly through rooms serving wine and clearing plates while maintaining the appropriately somber demeanor. For working-class families, the feast might be simpler but no less important. Bread and cheese, perhaps some cold meat if the family could afford it, tea and beer, biscuits baked by neighbors who contributed what they could to help the bereaved family fulfill their social obligations. Regardless of economic circumstances, the funeral feast served crucial social and psychological functions, providing mourners with sustenance after what might be hours of ceremony and burial, offering opportunity for shared remembrance and mutual comfort, demonstrating the family's respect for the deceased through their hospitality to those who came to pay respects. The timing of the funeral feast created the peculiar circumstance of eating in proximity to the dead body, which remained in the home until burial. Victorian funerals typically occurred at the family residence, with the deceased laid out in the best parlor for viewing by mourners who arrived to offer condolences. After the funeral service, which might be conducted at home or at church, the procession would depart for the cemetery, but not all mourners attended the actual interment. Many, particularly women, would remain at the house, and it was for these people primarily that the funeral feast was prepared. They would eat while the coffin sat nearby, or in some cases after the burial party had returned, creating the strange circumstance of the guest of honor being present but unable to participate, witnessing but not tasting the food served in their memory. This proximity to death while eating was not considered morbid, but rather appropriate, a way of including the deceased in the gathering, of maintaining their presence even as their absence was being mourned. Funeral biscuits held special significance in Victorian mourning traditions, distinct from other foods served at the feast. These were specially made cookies or cakes, often wrapped in black-edged paper printed with the deceased's name and dates, sometimes including religious verses or memorial poems. They would be distributed to funeral attendees as they departed, a tangible remembrance to take home, something that could be saved or consumed as a way of literally incorporating the memory of the dead. Some funeral biscuits were elaborate productions, expensive to commission, shaped into hearts or crosses, decorated with black icing or edible flowers. Others were simple rounds of shortbread or plain cake, affordable even for families of limited means, who nonetheless wanted to provide this customary token. The biscuits served multiple purposes. They were memorial objects, social obligations, and practical provisions for mourners who might have traveled distances to attend the funeral. Families kept funeral biscuits for years, stored in tins or wrapped carefully in drawers, tangible connections to losses that time might otherwise erase from immediate memory. The preparation of funeral food created its own rituals and social networks, particularly for women whose domestic sphere suddenly became the center of mourning activity. Female neighbors and relatives would arrive to help, transforming the bereaved family's kitchen into a production center, where vast quantities of food were prepared under circumstances of grief and time pressure. These women worked together, their shared labor creating bonds and offering the kind of practical support that words alone could not provide. The act of cooking for the funeral feast was itself a form of mourning, a way of serving the dead by caring for the living, of channeling grief into productive activity that had clear purpose and visible results. The recipes used were often traditional, passed down through families, specific dishes that were always served at funerals, creating culinary continuity across generations. A woman eating funeral food might taste the same cake her grandmother had eaten at funerals decades earlier, the familiar flavor connecting present loss to historical patterns of grief and recovery. The social dynamics of the funeral feast were complex, governed by unspoken rules about who sat where, who was served first, what topics could be discussed. The immediate family might eat separately or not at all, too consumed by grief to have appetite, while more distant relatives and friends filled plates and found seats. Conversations would begin tentatively, mourners uncertain how to behave, whether laughter was permitted, whether memories should be shared or silence maintained. But gradually, inevitably, the normal human response to gathering and eating would assert itself. Stories about the deceased would emerge, first cautiously, then with increasing freedom. Laughter might break through quickly, suppressed then accepted as people remembered funny incidents or characteristic quirks. The funeral feast became a space where the dead could be restored to life through narrative, where their personality could be reconstructed through shared anecdotes, where individual memories could be woven into collective remembrance. Food facilitated this transition, the act of eating together creating permission for social interaction that might otherwise seem inappropriate so close to death. Drink flowed freely at Victorian funeral feasts, more freely than at most other social gatherings where temperance movements were gaining influence and drunkenness was increasingly stigmatized. But at funerals, alcohol was considered necessary medicine for grief, appropriate balm for sorrow that needed numbing. Beer and wine were consumed in quantities that would have been scandalous at other events, and drunkenness at funerals was tolerated, or at least overlooked in ways it would not be elsewhere. Some mourners arrived already intoxicated, having begun drinking early to fortify themselves for the ordeal of funeral attendance. Others became drunk during the feast itself, grief and alcohol combining to produce emotional outbursts or maudlin declarations. The tolerance for drunkenness at funerals reflected recognition that grief needed outlets, that the emotional control demanded by Victorian social norms might require artificial assistance to maintain, that sometimes the only way to survive unbearable sorrow was to blur its edges through chemical intervention. The cost of funeral feasts could be crippling for working-class families, creating financial hardship that lasted long after the grief had dulled. The social obligation to provide hospitality was so strong that families would go into debt rather than fail to offer proper funeral food, borrowing money or selling possessions to purchase provisions that would be consumed in a single afternoon. Friendly societies and burial clubs existed partly to help members afford funeral expenses, including the cost of the feast, recognizing that death created financial crisis alongside emotional trauma. Some families spent more on the funeral feast than on the coffin itself, prioritizing social obligations over physical necessities, understanding that community judgment would be based on hospitality rather than on the quality of burial goods. This financial pressure was real and significant, contributing to cycles of poverty that trapped entire families in debt that could take years to repay. Yet the alternative, failing to provide appropriate funeral food, was socially unthinkable, marking the family as either too poor or too uncaring to properly honor their dead. By the late Victorian era, reformers were beginning to criticize the excesses of funeral feasts, arguing that elaborate hospitality placed unnecessary burdens on grieving families and encouraged wasteful spending on temporary display rather than practical support for survivors. Some religious groups promoted simpler funeral practices, emphasizing spiritual rather than social aspects of mourning, discouraging expensive feasts in favor of modest gatherings or charitable donations in the deceased's name. These reform efforts gained gradual traction, particularly among middle-class families influenced by evangelical movements and concerned with demonstrating proper values. But for most Victorians, the funeral feast remained essential, not an optional extra, but a core component of appropriate mourning, as necessary as the coffin itself. The shared meal transformed death from individual tragedy into communal event, distributed the emotional weight of loss across multiple shoulders, created space for collective processing of grief that private sorrow could not achieve alone. The Victorian funeral feast, with its strange combination of death and dining, corpse and cake, grief and gluttony, reveals fundamental truths about how humans cope with mortality. We eat together because eating is life, because consuming food while surrounded by death affirms that we continue, that loss has not destroyed us, that tomorrow we will hunger again. The feast says what words cannot, that the dead are gone, but the living remain, that sorrow is real, but so is appetite, that honoring the deceased includes acknowledging our own persistence. Modern funerals still include food, though we have moved it away from the body, separated the wake from the viewing, created distance between death and dining that the Victorians did not require. Perhaps we have lost something in that separation, some honest acknowledgement that life and death exist together, that eating in the presence of the deceased is not disrespectful, but rather a profound statement about continuity, about the fact that those who remain must nourish themselves, must gather and share, and eventually, impossibly, continue living in a world the dead have left. Open the pages of a Victorian Patent Office catalogue, and you will find yourself in a world where genius and absurdity dance together, where brilliant engineering serves bizarre purposes, where every human anxiety and aspiration has inspired someone to design a mechanical solution. The Victorians were obsessed with invention, believing that technology could solve any problem, cure any ailment, improve any aspect of human existence if only the right mechanism could be devised. This faith in mechanical progress produced genuine marvels. Yes, the steam engine and the telegraph and the photograph, but it also spawned an army of peculiar contraptions that reveal as much about Victorian fears and fantasies as they do about Victorian ingenuity. These strange devices, most of which failed spectacularly or never progressed beyond the prototype stage, offer windows into a culture trying desperately to control the uncontrollable, to mechanize the mysterious, to impose rational order on aspects of existence that stubbornly resisted such intervention. Sleep, that nightly surrender to unconsciousness that the Victorians both needed and feared, inspired numerous inventions designed to improve, regulate, or monitor this vulnerable state. The alarm bed represented one of the more aggressive approaches to waking, a contraption that at the appointed hour would literally eject the sleeper from the mattress through a system of springs and pulleys, dumping them unceremoniously onto the floor, where continued sleep became impossible. Less violent, but equally determined, were beds that gradually tilted until the occupant slid toward the floor, or that released cold water onto the sleeper's face, or that rang bells positioned directly beside the pillow at volumes designed to jolt even the deepest sleeper into panicked wakefulness. These devices reflected Victorian anxiety about idleness and the moral imperative of rising early, the belief that oversleeping represented moral weakness that required technological correction, that many of these beds were patented but never commercially successful, suggest that even Victorians had limits to the discomfort they would accept in pursuit of punctuality. The electric hairbrush promised to cure headaches, prevent baldness, stimulate the brain, and generally improve mental and physical health through the application of mild electrical current directly to the scalp. Victorian medicine was fascinated by electricity, seeing in this mysterious force potential cures for countless ailments, despite having only the vaguest understanding of how electricity affected the human body. The electric hairbrush contained batteries that delivered small shocks with each stroke, sensations that manufacturers claimed were therapeutic, but that users described as ranging from pleasant tingling to painful jolts, depending on the device's construction and the user's individual sensitivity. These brushes were expensive, marketed primarily to wealthy customers, who could afford to experiment with the latest health fads, and were accompanied by elaborate testimonials from satisfied users who attributed all manner of improvements to their regular use. Whether the brushes actually provided any medical benefit beyond placebo effect is doubtful, but they sold well enough to inspire imitators and variations, including electric combs, electric caps, and even electric beds that promised to cure insomnia through whole-body electrification. The mechanical servant represented Victorian dreams of automation applied to domestic labor, a clockwork figure that could perform simple household tasks and supposedly free human servants for more complex work. The most ambitious versions were humanoid in appearance, with articulated limbs and heads that could turn, designed to evoke the image of a person rather than a machine. In reality, these mechanical servants could perform only the simplest repetitive tasks, moving in predetermined patterns, incapable of adapting to obstacles or varying their routines. They were expensive curiosities rather than practical labor-saving devices, purchased primarily as conversation pieces and demonstrations of their owners' wealth and technological sophistication. Most spent more time being repaired than working, their delicate mechanisms vulnerable to dirt and breakdown, requiring more maintenance than the effort they saved justified. But the fantasy they represented, of a future where machines would perform all tedious labor, while humans engaged only in intellectual and creative pursuits, captured Victorian imagination and foreshadowed the automation debates that would dominate the next century. Devices designed to prevent improper thoughts or activities during sleep revealed Victorian anxieties about the body's autonomy during unconsciousness. the fear that the sleeping self might engage in behaviors the waking self would never permit. Anti-masturbation devices were particularly elaborate and disturbing, mechanical contraptions worn during sleep that would detect certain movements or physical states and respond with alarms, painful stimuli, or restraints that made the prohibited activity impossible. These devices were marketed to parents worried about their sons, to young men concerned about their own moral weakness, to doctors who believed that such activities caused everything from insanity to blindness to early death. The devices ranged from simple restraints to complex mechanisms involving locks and keys, from uncomfortable but harmless designs to genuinely dangerous contraptions that could cause injury. That these devices existed, were patented, manufactured, and sold reveals the depths of Victorian sexual anxiety and the willingness to inflict discomfort or pain in service of moral purity. Modern viewers find these devices almost comically cruel, but for the Victorians they represented serious attempts to use technology to enforce moral standards that the weak human will could not maintain alone. The wife alarm, a device designed to wake husbands when their wives called during the night, consisted of a string connecting the wife's bed to a bell positioned beside the husband's head, allowing her to summon assistance without leaving bed or raising her voice. This invention reflected Victorian assumptions about gender roles and female helplessness, the belief that women required constant availability of male protection even during sleep. That such a device needed to be invented suggests that husbands were not naturally responsive to their wives' nighttime needs, that the bond of marriage did not automatically create the attentiveness wives supposedly required. The device was marketed as promoting marital harmony by ensuring husbands could fulfill their protective duties, but it also revealed the artificiality of Victorian gender dynamics, the way natural human behavior had to be mechanically enforced to match ideological expectations about how men and women should relate to each other. Spirit communication devices proliferated during the height of Victorian spiritualism, inventions claiming to facilitate contact with the dead through technological means rather than relying on mediums' dubious abilities. Spirit telegraphs promised to send messages to the afterlife and receive responses, using electrical circuits that supposedly connected the material and spiritual planes. Spirit telephones claimed to make deceased voices audible through mechanical amplification of vibrations, too subtle for human ears to detect unaided. Psychographs attempted to capture spiritual writing automatically, producing text that supposedly originated from beyond the grave rather than from the operator's conscious mind. These devices appealed to Victorian desire for empirical evidence of the afterlife, the hope that spirits could be detected and measured like any other natural phenomenon if only the right instruments were developed. That none of these devices produced convincing results did not discourage inventors from creating new variations or believers from purchasing them, demonstrating how powerful the desire to communicate with the dead was and how willing people were to believe that technology might succeed where faith alone had failed. Photographic devices designed to capture thoughts, dreams, or auras represented the ultimate Victorian fantasy of making the invisible visible through technological innovation. Thought photography claimed to transfer mental images directly onto photographic plates, supposedly capturing what the mind saw internally, rather than what the eyes perceived externally. Dream recorders promised to photograph the images that appeared during sleep, providing objective records of subjective experiences that otherwise vanished upon waking. Aura cameras claimed to capture the subtle energy fields surrounding human bodies, making spiritual essence visible through special filters and exposure techniques. These devices produced images, certainly, but whether those images represented genuine phenomena or artifacts of photographic manipulation and suggestive interpretation remained hotly debated. The devices attracted both genuine believers and obvious charlatans, creating markets where hope and fraud intermingled so thoroughly that separating one from the other became nearly impossible. What these devices reveal most clearly is Victorian faith in photography as objective truth-teller, the belief that cameras could not lie, and therefore anything captured on film must represent genuine reality rather than technical artifact or deliberate deception. The Victorian catalogue of curious inventions extends far beyond these examples, encompassing thousands of patented devices addressing every conceivable problem and many that no sane person would consider problems at all. There were mechanical devices for lifting hats politely, for producing dimples in cheeks deemed insufficiently charming, for stretching noses to more aristocratic lengths, for training infants to crawl in approved patterns. There were elaborate contraptions for opening windows without leaving bed, for warming sheets before entering them, for measuring sleep quality through movements and sounds. Each invention represented someone's conviction that they had identified a problem requiring solution and that mechanical ingenuity could provide that solution. Most failed, disappeared, left no trace beyond patent documents gathering dust in archives. But collectively, they reveal a culture intoxicated by possibility, convinced that the future would be shaped by inventors and engineers, that every difficulty could be overcome through clever application of gears and springs and electrical current. The Victorians built the modern world, yes, but they also tried to build 1,000 impossible worlds, and in their failures, we see the limits of what technology can accomplish, the boundaries where human problems resist mechanical solutions and require instead the messy, imperfect interventions of wisdom, compassion, and acceptance that some mysteries should remain unsolved. We have walked together through the shadows of Victorian England, through parlors where the dead were photographed as if sleeping, through bedrooms sealed against poisonous night air, through streets where mourners wore their grief like armor, woven from black bombazine and human hair. We have witnessed customs that seem bizarre to modern eyes, rituals that make us recoil, fears that appear irrational, and solutions that strike us as absurd. But if we look more carefully, if we allow the gaslight to illuminate not just their world, but also our own, we might discover that the Victorians are not as distant as we imagine, that their anxieties echo in our own era's obsessions, that their strange relationship with death reveals truths we have spent a century trying to forget. The veil between their time and ours is thinner than we pretend, and the voices that speak across it carry warnings and wisdom we ignore at our peril. The Victorians lived intimately with death in ways we cannot imagine and would not tolerate. They kept corpses in their parlors, slept in rooms where family members had recently died, wore jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, photographed their dead children with painted-on eyes to create illusions of life. We find these practices macabre, evidence of a culture obsessed with mortality to unhealthy degrees. But perhaps our horror reflects not their excess, but rather our own denial, our determination to sanitize death until it becomes abstract, something that happens to other people in other places, hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes where we need not confront it directly. The Victorians understood what we have forgotten, that death is part of life, that pretending otherwise does not make it less real, that avoiding the sight of mortality does not prevent its arrival. Their elaborate mourning rituals, for all their strangeness, allowed communities to process grief collectively, provided clear frameworks for moving through sorrow, acknowledged that loss changes us, and that those changes deserve recognition and time. We have abandoned most of these rituals, leaving individuals to navigate grief alone, uncertain how long is appropriate to mourn, uncomfortable with public displays of sorrow that Victorian society not only permitted but required. Perhaps we have lost something valuable in our efficiency, our hurry to return to normal, our insistence that grief should be private and brief. The Victorian fear of night air, their conviction that darkness carried poison, seems laughable until we recognize our own elaborate defenses against invisible dangers. They sealed their windows and surrounded their beds with curtains, creating stuffy enclosed spaces that actually worsened the diseases they feared. We seal ourselves in climate-controlled environments, breathing recycled air, avoiding the outdoors, convinced that we have conquered through technology when in fact we have merely created different vulnerabilities. They worried about miasmas and bad humors. We worry about germs and toxins and electromagnetic radiation. The specific fears change, but the pattern remains. Human anxiety, seeking explanations for suffering, finding those explanations in invisible environmental threats, developing elaborate protective rituals that may or may not address the actual dangers. The Victorians were wrong about night air, yes, but their mistake was one of mechanism rather than instinct. They recognized that environment affects health, that what we breathe and touch and surround ourselves with matters, that invisible factors can cause visible harm. They just misidentified which factors and which harms, a mistake we continue making with our own era's confident assertions about what is safe and what is dangerous. Victorian beauty standards that drove women to consume arsenic, to wear poisonous green dresses, to apply toxic cosmetics in pursuit of fashionable pallor, seem horrifyingly self-destructive until we examine our own willingness to harm ourselves for appearance. We inject botulinum toxin into our faces, undergo surgical procedures with genuine risks, starve ourselves or consume dangerous supplements, all in service of beauty standards as arbitrary and demanding as anything the Victorians imposed on themselves. They valued pale skin that signified leisure class status. We value tanned skin for the same reason, proof that we can afford tropical vacations. They corseted their bodies into unnatural shapes that damaged internal organs. We have different tortures but similar results, pursuing ideals that require constant maintenance and cause measurable harm. The specific aesthetics change, but the underlying pattern persists. Societies establishing beauty standards that are difficult to achieve naturally. Industries profiting from products and services that promise to bridge the gap between natural appearance and cultural ideal. Individuals caught between desire to conform and awareness that conformity carries costs. The Victorian woman dosing herself with arsenic wafers to achieve ghostly complexion was engaging in behavior fundamentally identical to modern injection of foreign substances into skin and muscle to achieve contemporary beauty ideals. We have not progressed beyond their vanity, merely changed its expression. The Victorian embrace of laudanum and opiates, the casual dosing of infants and adults with powerful narcotics disguised as medicine, horrifies us until we confront our own prescription drug crisis. Our society, where millions are addicted to opioids originally prescribed for legitimate medical reasons. They had Godfrey's cordial for fussy babies. We had OxyContin for chronic pain. Different names, same drugs, same trajectory from medical use to dependency to destruction. The Victorians thought they were being good parents by quieting crying infants with opiate-laced preparations. We thought we were managing pain appropriately by trusting pharmaceutical companies and prescribing doctors. Both eras convinced themselves that the drugs were safe when used as directed, that addiction happened only to the morally weak or those who misused the substances, that the benefits outweighed the risks. Both were catastrophically wrong, and in both cases, the realization of error came far too late for millions who had already fallen into dependency. The Victorian mother reaching for the laudanum bottle and the modern parent filling a prescription are making the same choice, trusting that medical authorities understand the substances they recommend, believing that respectable use differs fundamentally from addiction, discovering too late that the drugs do not distinguish between proper patients and improper addicts. Victorian spiritualism, the desperate attempt to contact the dead through seances and spirit photography and elaborate rituals, seems like gullibility until we recognize our own hunger for evidence that death is not final. They gathered in darkened rooms, hoping to hear voices from beyond. We consume television shows about mediums, attend readings by psychics, embrace near-death experiences as proof of afterlife. They paid for spirit photographs that were obvious frauds. We pay for psychic consultations delivered through modern technology, but based on the same cold reading techniques Victorian mediums used. The desire to believe that consciousness survives death, that our loved ones persist somewhere accessible, that separation is temporary rather than permanent, transcends centuries and cultures. The Victorians were not uniquely credulous, but rather normally human, exhibiting the same need for comfort in the face of loss that drives contemporary interest in paranormal claims. We mock their seances while engaging in our own versions of the same behaviors, convinced that our methods are more sophisticated when in fact they are merely more expensive and technologically mediated. The Victorian terror of premature burial, their elaborate safety coffins with bells and speaking tubes, reflects anxiety about loss of agency, about being trapped in situations where we cannot communicate, where others have decided our fate without our consent. This fear has not disappeared, but rather evolved. We worry about being kept alive artificially when we would choose to die, about having our wishes ignored, about medical systems that prioritize institutional convenience over individual autonomy. We create living wills and advance directives, legal documents that attempt to ensure our voices will be heard even when we cannot speak, that our choices will be honored even when we are unconscious. These are our safety coffins, our bells ringing from the grave, our attempts to maintain agency across the boundary where consciousness fails. The specific fear has shifted from being buried alive to being kept alive artificially, but the underlying terror remains identical. That we will be trapped in bodies others control, unable to communicate, presumed to want something different from what we actually desire. As our journey through Victorian darkness reaches its conclusion, I want to invite you one final time to subscribe to Boring Bedtime Stories. If these explorations of the past have helped you understand the present differently, if you have found comfort or fascination in these strange tales from vanished eras, then join our community. We gather here regularly, those of us who find peace in history's shadows, who believe that the dead have lessons for the living, who understand that sleep comes easier when we acknowledge rather than deny the darkness that surrounds us. Subscribe now, and let us continue walking together through time's forgotten corners, discovering that what we thought was strange was actually familiar, that what seemed distant was actually close, that the past is never quite as past as we imagine. The Victorians whisper to us from across their gaslit century, and if we listen carefully, we hear not warnings about their mistakes, but rather recognition of our own. They were not more superstitious than we are, merely superstitious about different things. They were not more vain, simply vain in different directions. They were not more death-obsessed, just more honest about mortality's centrality to human experience. They were not strangers from an incomprehensible past, but rather people navigating existence with the same fears, hopes, griefs, and desires that shape our own lives. The customs that seem bizarre were their attempts to create meaning and order in a world that offered neither naturally, to impose ritual and structure on experiences that felt overwhelming, to transform individual suffering into collective acknowledgement that suffering matters and that those who suffer deserve support. We have abandoned many of their rituals, but we have not solved the problems those rituals addressed. We still grieve, still die, still seek beauty, still fear loss of control, still hunger for proof that death is not the end. We simply face these universal human challenges without the frameworks Victorian culture provided, leaving us lonelier and less supported than we need to be. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, carrying these Victorian shadows with you into dreams, remember that the gaslight illuminates both directions. Yes, we can see their world more clearly by understanding our own, but we can also see our world more clearly by understanding theirs. The veil between then and now is gossamer thin, and the voices speaking across it are not alien but familiar, not warning us away from their mistakes, but rather inviting us to recognize how much we share. Sleep well, knowing that every era has its darkness, its fears, its strange customs that future generations will find incomprehensible. We are not immune to history's judgment any more than the Victorians were. But we are also not alone, separated from them by only time and technology, connected by the deeper currents of human need and human that flow unchanged beneath centuries of surface transformation. The Victorians understood something essential, that acknowledging darkness does not increase it, that speaking about death does not hasten its arrival, that facing fears directly renders them less powerful than pretending they do not exist. Perhaps it is time we remembered what they knew. Close your eyes now and let history's whispers carry you into rest.